When Russia's nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missile, ominously dubbed the Satan II, was first tested in 2022, the country's president Vladimir Putin called it a truly unique weapon that would force other countries threatening Russia to think twice. He also said the missile had the highest tactical and technical characteristics and had no analogues in the world. Fast forward to 2024, and it seems the only thing truly unique about the Satan II is its ability to self-destruct before even leaving the test launch pad, making one wonder if even the missile has had enough of Putin's leadership. The failed test did send shockwaves, not across the globe as Putin had envisioned, but directly into the face of his regime's overblown rhetoric. But how did this mighty weapon of mass embarrassment manage to fail so spectacularly? And how do we even know about it, given the Kremlin's obsession with keeping its disasters under wraps? We've got all the answers for you in this video. Now, one question might arise instantly. What is Russia doing testing nuclear missiles while the country is itself falling apart at the seams? 2.5 years into what was supposed to be a David versus Goliath conflict, Ukraine, aka David, has managed to assume the role of the invader with its incursion into the Kursk region and embarrass Goliath on pretty much a daily basis. And here Putin and his cronies are playing missile launch bingo. Well, this wannabe nuclear test was actually a desperate ploy to salvage Russia's reputation through intimidation. Once touted as possessing the second strongest military in the world, Russia has now become a laughingstock on the Ukrainian battlefield, facing humiliation and defeat at every turn since the invasion began. That's why Putin and his lapdogs have been scrambling to save face, and with the Russian soldiers falling like flies, their supposedly superior tanks reduced to scrap metal by Bradley fighting vehicles, essentially glorified battle taxis, and their once mighty Black Sea fleet getting wrecked by a country with no navy, the last thing Putin can boast of is the country's nuclear arsenal. And boy, did he take his last-ditch effort seriously. First, Putin announced that Russia would suspend its participation in the nuclear arms pact called the New START Treaty back in February 2023. This pact, the last remaining nuclear arms control pact involving both Russia and the US, was designed to limit the number of nuclear warheads each country could possess. It was a symbolic gesture of stability and restraint in an increasingly volatile world. But with the tide of war turning against him, Putin tore up the rulebook on nuclear arms control in an effort to project an image of power and intimidate his enemies. This is also when Putin first announced that Russia would resume nuclear testing, because its number one enemy, the US, was doing so as well. And the US certainly did, conducting a Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile (ICBM) test launch in September of 2023. But you see, the difference between this test and the one that would take place in Russia a year later is that the US actually managed to launch its missile. Believe it or not, the ICBM's re-entry vehicle even managed to travel roughly 4,200 miles to the Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Now that's just showing off. Naturally, Russia initially thought it could replicate the US's success and one-up their adversary. So Sergei Karakayev, the commander of the Strategic Missile Forces of the Russian Federation, announced that the country intended to carry out 7 ICBM tests in 2024. The ultimate fate of these tests might be deserving of an entirely separate video, but for this one, here's how Putin and his propaganda posse tried to paint a picture of invincibility behind Russia's nuclear arsenal. Knowing that all this talk ends in an epic embarrassment makes the following attempts at posturing all the more entertaining. Let's start with the Kremlin's spin doctor-in-chief, Putin. In June 2024, Putin held a now rare press conference with senior editors from international media outlets. At the conference, Putin once again threatened to use nuclear weapons and even provided a justification for it. Here's what he said. "We have a nuclear doctrine. Look what it says. If someone's actions threaten our sovereignty and territorial integrity, we consider it possible for us to use all means at our disposal. This should not be taken lightly, superficially." In September 2022, Putin boldly declared that he was not bluffing, so it seems that he has traded his bravado for a more cautious tone. This might be due to the fact that reality has caught up with his bluster, leaving him with a hefty dose of humility, or perhaps it has to do with the fact that it was proven time and time again that he was, in fact, bluffing. The latest red line that caused Putin's threats, Ukraine receiving permission to strike Russian soil with Western-supplied weapons, is probably the 100th red line he's drawn in the sand. Each time he declares it the point of no return, only to watch Ukraine charge forward, rendering his warnings as hollow as his military promises. The next in line to threaten nuclear annihilation and essentially hype up a massive failure is Dmitry Medvedev, the Deputy Secretary of the Russian Security Council and arguably the clown prince of the Kremlin. Russia's former president took to Telegram in September of 2024 to threaten to turn Kyiv into a giant blot of molten grey mess. although Medvedev's erratic telegram ramblings are too good not to be shared in their entirety, we'll give you a synopsis for the sake of brevity and sanity. Medvedev started off his message by describing how the Western world sees the Russian threats of nuclear annihilation. He said that the West believed that the Russians won't cross the line and that they only wanted to scare the West. And anyway, who needs an apocalypse, he added. And that's probably the only sane part of his entire message, together with deeming the nuclear conflict a very bad story with a dire outcome and calling a nuclear response a hugely complex decision with irreversible consequences. Hearing this, you might even think that Medvedev had a moment of clarity, a brief flash of reason amidst the chaos of his usual bombast. But no such luck, for in the very next line he said, "What the pompous Anglo-Saxon dimwits fail to admit, though, is that you can only test someone's patience for so long. It will turn out in the end that certain moderate Western analysts were right when they warned. True, the Russians are not likely to use this response, although it's still a possibility." He then ended his message by saying, "And then it's over. A giant blot of molten grey mess in the place where the mother of Russian cities, the historic name of Kiev, once stood." He even threw in an English expletive at the end for good measure. With this bizarre message in mind, you'll probably understand why the US Department of State answered what they referred to as standard Kremlin nonsense with one sentence: "We know by now not to take Medvedev seriously." The final piece of the propaganda puzzle came from Sergei Lavrov, Russia's Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Kremlin's master of misdirection. Mere days before the Satan II missile exploded in Putin's face, Lavrov delivered a theatrical warning to the West, promising that Moscow's nuclear arsenal was at full combat readiness. In a speech that seemed to rip straight from a B-movie script, Lavrov declared, "We talk about red lines, expecting that our statements will be heard by intelligent, decision-making people." He added that he was convinced that in such situations, decision-makers have an idea of what the Kremlin is talking about, as nobody wants a nuclear war. Lavrov's remarks were supposed to set the stage for this massive test, a show of force meant to intimidate anyone who dared question Russia's resolve. But instead of instilling dread, it became evident that the whole plan was destined for disaster, as Lavrov waxed poetic about the weapons whose use will involve grave consequences for the masters of the Ukrainian regime. The only thing he truly managed to achieve was to make the failure of the upcoming launch all the more laughable. Speaking of the launch, or of the attempt to launch, rather, let's finally break down what happened on that fateful day in September. According to Pavel Podvig, the analyst running the Russian Nuclear Forces research project, the attempted launch of the Satan II likely took place on September 9, 2024. Podvig made this conclusion based on a Notice to Air Missions, or NOTAM for short, issued to the pilots in the area on September 17th and cancelled 2 days later on September 19th. The NOTAM notification is a crucial safety measure in aviation, informing pilots of any potential hazards in the vicinity. In this case, it appears that the Russian military was attempting to create a no-fly zone for the imminent missile test, likely hoping to ensure that nothing would interfere with their grand display of firepower. The display in question was supposed to occur at the Plesetsk Cosmodrome, a strategic location nestled in the Arkhangelsk region of Russia. Situated approximately 500 miles north of Moscow and about 250 miles east of Finland's border, this spaceport is the northernmost operational orbital launch site in the world. Originally developed as an ICBM site for the Soviet R-7 Semyorka missile developed during the Cold War, Plesetsk has evolved into a hub for various military and satellite launches, making it a critical asset in Russia's defense and space capabilities. With this in mind, it's no wonder this location, surrounded by dense boreal pine forests and flat terrain, was chosen to be the stage for a powerful display of Russian military might. However, the only thing it ended up being was a backdrop for another colossal failure coming from Russia. This time, the failure involved the RS-28 Sarmat super heavy intercontinental ballistic missile that we've been referring to by its colloquial name, Satan II. Let's get to know this infamous missile a little better before it inevitably stumbles its way into the annals of military bloopers. The RS-28 Sarmat is a 3-stage, silo-based, liquid-fueled ICBM designed to replace the Soviet-era R-36M model in Russia's arsenal. As you can probably guess, the R-36M was the original Satan, courtesy of NATO reporting names. With a length of 115.8 feet and a diameter of almost 10 feet, the Satan II boasts a hefty launch weight of around 460,000 pounds. Thanks to a rather impressive operational range of 11,000 miles, the Satan II could target virtually any location in the US and Europe with precision. That is, of course, if it managed to actually launch first. All jokes aside, the RS-28 missile being grounded is the best-case scenario for the rest of the world. Why? Because the missile can carry up to 10 tons of payload. The sheer amount of payload translates to a variety of warhead options, including hypersonic glide vehicles, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, and of course, nuclear warheads. In total, the Sarmat can reportedly carry up to 10 large warheads and 16 smaller ones. This menacing versatility and impressive capacity is what makes the RS-28 a significant component of Russia's strategic deterrent capability. It was one of 6 Russian strategic weapons unveiled by Putin in 2018, with a promise to bolster Russia's military might in an increasingly tense global landscape. So for now, we know that the Satan II was introduced in 2018 and first tested in 2022. This means that we aren't talking about some old Soviet-era weapon that was doomed to fail due to sheer age and questionable engineering. No, this is supposed to be a cutting-edge missile that's fresh off the assembly line. And yet, on September 19th, instead of roaring through the skies, the Satan II dramatically, unequivocally, and embarrassingly stayed put. In other words, the supposed ICBM test failed before it even began. Here are all the details we know. According to Podvig, the Sarmat likely exploded while being defueled, leaving a massive crater in the ground. Reports of the incident first emerged on social media, notably from the open-source analyst active on X, formerly Twitter, under the handle @MENMYRC1. The analyst in question noted that the missile detonated in the silo, essentially obliterating the surrounding launch site. This was later confirmed by multiple major news outlets. Now you might wonder, how can a missile wreak such havoc before even taking off? The answer lies in Sarmat's capabilities, which we've already discussed in this video. For a missile to be able to reach distances of up to 11,000 miles, it has to pack a lot of fuel. Of course, all this fuel creates more than enough explosive potential on board the missile. Simply put, when things went awry, the fuel did what fuel does when ignited. It exploded. Now, this answer might surprise you, as we've been referring to the Satan II as a nuclear missile. However, while this missile is certainly nuclear capable, it's important to note that it wasn't loaded with any nuclear warheads during this catastrophic test. What's more, the mere fact that this was indeed a test tells us that the missile was not carrying any real warheads, just dummy warheads used for data-taking purposes. But how do we know the Sarmats didn't take off and merely exploded close to the ground? There are 2 key reasons. Number 1, the destruction surrounding the missile silo indicates a failure shortly after ignition. According to Timothy Wright from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, this indicates that the first stage of the missile either failed to ignite properly or suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure, causing it to fall back into the silo and explode. Number 2, during typical missile tests, NATO's Cobra Ball reconnaissance aircraft is always deployed to monitor the launch. However, the absence of this aircraft during the final stages of the test suggests that the missile never left the ground. The silence from these keen-eyed watchers speaks volumes. If they're not up in the air, you can bet there's nothing worth watching. It seems that much like its Supreme Commander Putin, the Satan II is all talk and no action. But wait a second, how do we even know about this failure in the first place? It's not like Russia would eagerly broadcast such a colossal blunder. That's where open-source intelligence saves the day. Thanks to satellite imagery analyzed by experts, we've got a front-row seat to the carnage. The analyst we mentioned just now, @MENMYRC1, first shared satellite imagery provided by Planet Labs, a US-based Earth imaging company. The image in question, captured on September 21, 2024 at 6:50 a.m. Coordinated Universal Time, offers an undeniable glimpse of the destruction. When compared to earlier satellite images from July 10th of the same location, it's abundantly clear that something went disastrously wrong. What was once a pristine launch site has now been reduced to a crater-strewn mess. The stark contrast between the before and after image, as well as the 200-foot wide crater, leaves little doubt. This was a failed test, and a spectacular one at that. But here's the kicker. Anyone who knows the testing history of the RS-28 Sarmat missile won't be surprised by this outcome. How so? Remember the first test of this missile we mentioned at the beginning, the one in 2022? Well, that's also the only successful test flight it ever had. Since then, which was April of 2022, it was one failure after another. Take February 2023. Just 2 days before President Joe Biden's visit to Kyiv, Russia tried to flex its muscles by testing Sarmat again. But instead of a triumphant show of power, the test was a complete flop. According to the Russian independent news outlet Sirena, the Sarmat fell shortly after taking off with virtually no explanation. US officials later confirmed that the missile failed miserably, adding another strike to its growing list of failures. Never one to admit defeat, Russia attempted another test shortly after the embarrassing February setbacks. Spoiler alert, it also failed. In fact, the entire launch was cancelled due to a failure in the missile's centralized control system. Fast forward to October 2023 and we have yet another failure, but this time the telemetry system failed. According to Sirena, this failure was explained by a human error. In November 2023, the Sarmat fell 77 seconds into the flight, landing some 186 miles from the launch site. Just as with the test in February, there was no explanation of what went wrong. And then came September 2024, when things really hit rock bottom, quite literally. So what we're left with is a so-called cutting-edge weapon that spent more time digging craters than flying through the air. Now you might think that this outright humiliating track record would be enough to dissuade Russia from parading Satan II as their crown jewel of military innovation. But surprise, this missile officially entered operational service in September 2023, becoming the world's longest range and most powerful extant ICBM system. On paper, of course. Even after the explosion we've discussed in this video and the subsequent destruction of its launch site, Nikolai Sokov, a former Russian and Soviet arms control official, said that Moscow would likely persist with the Sarmat program. Apparently, when your missile is better at landscaping than launching, the only logical move is to just keep digging. The Kremlin, for its part, has stayed remarkably tight-lipped. When questioned about the alleged explosion, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov dodged the issue entirely, stating, "We do not have any information on this matter." In classic fashion, they passed the buck to the Russian Ministry of Defense, which, unsurprisingly, offered no comment either. It seems that in Russia, when missiles fail, so does transparency. As for the rest of the world, reactions have been mixed, though largely unimpressed. Tom Caracco, the director of the Center for Strategic and International Studies Missile Defense Project, dismissed the latest Sarmat test as mere nuclear saber-rattling. He pointed out that while the US is working to modernize its own nuclear forces, which are relatively older, Russia has been throwing considerable efforts into projects like the Sarmat. And yet despite all that effort, the Sarmat's recent track record suggests it's more of a paper tiger than a fearsome beast. Worst of all, the Sarmat failures are far from the only unsuccessful tests of nuclear weaponry in Russia. On June 30th, 2023, Russia tried to test its Poseidon apparatus, officially known as Status 6 Oceanic Multipurpose System. This was one of the 6 strategic weapons Putin announced in 2018, together with the RS-28 Sarmat. The Poseidon is an underwater nuclear-capable torpedo designed to hit coastal areas, ships, and naval bases. When tested in June, this torpedo was reportedly thrown off the silo, after which it sank. The reason behind this failure was a faulty sensor, which prevented the reactor from starting. Surprisingly, this fiasco seems to have rattled Russia a bit since the next launch, scheduled for late October or early November, was postponed, and no other tests have been reported since. Another wildly unsuccessful test took place on October 25, 2023, when Putin himself was supposed to oversee a series of so-called presidential launches. While the Kremlin claimed everything went off without a hitch, Sirena reported that the RS-24 Yars missile fell during the second phase of its flight, while the RSM-56 Bulava missile was cancelled at the last moment. The former weapon is a thermonuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missile with a range of roughly 6,525 miles and the ability to carry multiple, independently targetable re-entry vehicles. The latter is a submarine-launched ballistic missile developed for Russia's Borai-class nuclear submarines. This missile has a range of around 5,150 miles and can also carry multiple warheads. But what does the Russian president think about the failure of his launches and all the other failures we've mentioned in the video? Well, for Putin, it's business as usual: threats, propaganda, and some well-crafted deflection. At the moment, he's laser-focused on preventing the United Kingdom from allowing Ukraine to use British-made Storm Shadow long-range missiles against Russian targets. He previously failed to do the same with the US, which supplied Ukraine with longer-range ATACMS, Army Tactical Missile System, missiles, and allowed its armed forces to use these missiles to strike Russian soil. On September 25th, mere days after the catastrophic nuclear missile explosion on the same soil, Putin issued yet another warning to the West. During a meeting of Russia's Security Council, Putin revealed that the Kremlin was updating its nuclear doctrine in response to what he described as a rapidly changing global landscape filled with new threats and risks. A significant aspect of this updated doctrine is the stipulation that any aggression against Russia by a non-nuclear state, particularly if supported by a nuclear power, would be viewed as a joint attack on Russia. This broadens the scope of perceived threats and escalates the potential for nuclear engagement. Putin articulated specific conditions under which Russia might transition to nuclear weapon use, particularly in the event of a large-scale assault involving missiles, aircraft, or drones. He emphasized that the use of nuclear weapons could also be warranted if Russia or its ally Belarus faced conventional aggression. These remarks signify a significant shift in Moscow's nuclear posture, allowing for a wider interpretation of when nuclear weapons could be deemed necessary. It's obvious that Putin will do as much mental gymnastics as necessary to try and justify his increasingly aggressive stance. Just days before the latest Sarmat missile disaster, Putin held a press conference that can only be described as a masterclass in the art of deflection. With a straight face, he spun a tale about why the potential use of Western-supplied long-range weapons against Russian territory was just too much to bear. It seems that in Putin's world, the Ukrainian army is utterly incapable of operating high-tech weapons without NATO's hand-holding. In his classic style, he claimed that only NATO military personnel can assign flight missions, implying that the only way these long-range weapons were being used in Ukraine is through direct NATO involvement. Putin went on to declare that any NATO involvement in the conflict would be tantamount to a declaration of war against Russia. He argued, if this decision to use long-range weapons is made, it will mean nothing short of direct involvement. And NATO's direct involvement in Ukraine is an act of war, according to Putin. His exact words were, "This will mean that NATO countries, the United States and European countries, are at war with Russia. And if this is the case, then, bearing in mind the change in the essence of the conflict, we will make appropriate decisions in response to the threats that will be posed to us." But let's be honest here. This whole speech is just a thinly veiled attempt to shield himself from the mounting pressure of military failures on the ground. After all, if his missiles are blowing up in his own backyard, the last thing he wants is for anyone to think he can't handle a little Western assistance. But what do you think about Putin's claims regarding Ukraine's ability to use Western weapons without direct NATO assistance? Is he justified in his concerns in any way? And to bring you back to the topic of the video, what do you think the recent Sarmat missile failure reveals about Russia's military capabilities and how it will affect Russia's nuclear strategy going forward? And lastly, and maybe most importantly, how much humiliation can one president take before he considers a new career path? Russia's forces should have been overwhelming. By December 2021, it had amassed around 100,000 troops around Ukraine, surrounding the country on 3 sides. When Russia finally entered Ukraine in February 2022, it had assembled 83 battalion tactical groups, with the initial incursion seeing up to 200,000 soldiers invade in what was supposed to be a smash-and-grab exercise. Their goal was simple: secure Kyiv in a matter of weeks so Russian President Vladimir Putin could depose Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and claim Ukraine as part of Russia. Only, that's not what happened. Facing seemingly insurmountable odds, the valiant Ukrainian troops pushed Russia's initial advance back. And since February 2022, those soldiers have fought valiantly, slowing Russia's progress to a crawl, retaking key cities like Kharkiv, and as of August 6, 2024, entering Russian territory to conduct an invasion of their own. Russia has been outsmarted at every turn, outmaneuvered regularly by a Ukrainian military at dwarfs both in terms of sheer manpower and the amount of equipment that it has at its disposal. And now Ukraine is no longer holding the line while trying to defend itself, it's overseeing the crumbling of the Russian military that will ultimately see Putin and his army collapse under the very type of pressure he tried to exert on Ukraine. That's the opinion of retired US General David Petraeus. But why does Petraeus believe that Russia's military is on the verge of crumbling? This video will answer that question using interview quotes from the general himself, along with evidence to support the claims he makes. But before answering that question, we need to answer another. Who is David Petraeus? Born in November 1952, Petraeus is a US Army general who was appointed to lead the multinational forces former President George W. Bush amassed to serve in Iraq in 2007. Petraeus is also the former Commander-in-Chief of Central Command, or CENTCOM, a role in which he served between 2008 and 2010. As well as a former director of the CIA and one of the commanders who led the US and NATO forces in Afghanistan. He has received a slew of honors for his service, including the Distinguished Service Medal, 4 Legion of Merit Awards, a pair of Defense Superior Service Medals, and a Bronze Star with a V device, which is given to those who display great valor. In other words, he's a military expert who has seen and done it all. So when he talks about the state of Putin's military, it's wise to listen to what he has to say. That brings us to August 18, 2024. On that date, interview footage emerged of Petraeus speaking about the strategic brilliance Ukraine has displayed during its war with Russia, and how that brilliance has allowed Ukraine to reshape the entire war. It's taken the war out of Putin's control, grasping the momentum and putting Putin in a position where he has to watch the slow collapse of a military that many believed to be one of the world's strongest before February 2022. Petraeus starts with a brief analysis of Ukraine's invasion of Kursk. They did achieve enormous surprise with the Russians. They managed to assemble elements of 4 brigades, not just infantry and armor, but also artillery, air defenses, electronic warfare, and so forth. So it's a real combined arms effort with logistics. Petraeus refers, of course, to Ukraine's initial invasion of Kursk. Russia attempted to downplay that invasion, which began on August 6, 2024, claiming that it had ended what it dubbed a small incursion. It hadn't. The initial group of 300 Ukrainians that's believed to have crossed the border on that date has since been supplemented with several thousand more, with Ukraine also claiming to control 482 square miles of Kursk. That includes over 90 settlements, according to Zelensky, with the success coming as a result of the combined arms effort that Petraeus highlights. The retired general also highlights one of the key mistakes Putin made that enabled the Kursk invasion in the first place, pointing out that the Russian defenses on the border were not very substantial. Again, that's been backed up by later reports, which were mostly made up of recent conscripts, many of whom were aged between 18 and 20. An August 30th report in the Moscow Times notes that the deaths and surrenders of these conscripts highlighted a hollow civic identity within Russia, while adding that the loss of those conscripts will resonate within Russian society. That's bad enough for Putin. However, the Moscow Times also notes that the use of conscripts in such a vital area shows that the Russian army has degraded to the point where it cannot fight a fully fledged war with professional soldiers. In other words, Russia has been exposed. When Petraeus says that the border defenses were not very substantial, he's actually hinting at the fact that Russia's military has already collapsed to such a point that it's relying on inexperienced and poorly trained conscripts to defend its own territory. Back to Petraeus, he also reveals what Ukraine has already gained from the Kursk invasion. They're pushing the Russians out. From this, they're gaining an enormous morale boost. They're collecting Russian prisoners for later exchange for Ukrainian prisoners held by Russia. They've also cut a very important rail line that Russia used to send logistics and troops from, say, the Moscow region down to the southeastern part of Ukraine. There's a fair amount to unpack here. On the subject of morale, it's clear that the Kursk invasion has had a positive effect. Speaking to Reuters on August 21st, 51-year-old Kyiv resident Ola Pavlovska said, "This was a very brave and important step for keeping up morale in society." Her words are echoed by many in Kyiv, as well as soldiers who were involved in the invasion. The Kursk invasion isn't a simple act of Ukraine taking Russian territory. It's a demonstration, one that shows Ukraine is now fighting the war on its own terms, rather than Russia's. And again, the fact that the invasion was successful showcases the weaknesses of Russia in key areas. It may be pouring hundreds of thousands of soldiers into Ukraine, but it's doing so while its internal defenses crumble. As for prisoners, Ukraine now has plenty of those. On August 27th, Kyiv's chief commander, Alexander Syrsky, claimed that Ukraine had captured a staggering 594 prisoners of war, or POWs, in just 21 days, meaning prisoners are being taken at a rate of around 28 per day. "We managed to increase our exchange fund," Syrsky said, which reinforces Petraeus' comments that Ukraine now has more leverage to get back some of its lost troops as a result of Kursk. Even in these early comments from Petraeus, we see evidence that Russia's military is crumbling. It barely put up a defense against Ukraine's incursion, with those defending being recent conscripts rather than experienced Russian soldiers. And it's losing men to surrender at an alarming rate. Add to this actions like the crippling of the rail line Petraeus mentions, and you see how Ukraine is also attempting to cut the Russians that are in its country off from their own country. The loss of that line means fewer troops and less equipment entering Ukraine from the north, setting the stage for further Russian crumbling later on. The situation is so bad, claims Petraeus, that Russia has been forced to scramble. They're having to pull forces from the southern area to react to this. It's obvious that their border forces, the irregular territorial forces, and the National Guard have been incapable of standing up to the Ukrainians. Again, the evidence backs him up. In the same Politico piece in which Syrsky claimed Ukraine had taken almost 600 prisoners, Ukraine's leading general also highlighted how many soldiers Russia has been forced to send to Kursk. He says that the Kremlin has sent some 30,000 soldiers from other directions to Kursk, and their number is growing. That may seem like a logical response from Moscow, and it is, but it's also a response that shows weakness in the Russian military. If Putin's forces were as strong as he would like the rest of the world to believe, he wouldn't need to divert soldiers from key locations in Ukraine to defend Kursk. He'd simply send some from Moscow or elsewhere in Russian territory. But he's having to weaken his attack in Ukraine so he can defend Russian territory, which reinforces Petraeus' point that Russia's internal defenses simply aren't strong enough. We may not be seeing the collapse of the Russian military in terms of the sheer number of soldiers, but the fact that 30,000 troops have been moved from Ukraine suggests that there's a major skill problem in Russia's military. Putin doesn't feel he can rely on the soldiers he has in Russia to do the job, which once again means Ukraine has succeeded in exposing Russia's frailty. Petraeus then switches focus to consider the broader implications of the Kursk invasion on the Ukraine war, particularly when it comes to Russia's attempts to taking more territory in the Donetsk region. "I think they're trying to continue their offensive in the southeastern area, and Donetsk in particular, and not interfere with that. And that does, to be fair, continue to achieve incremental gains against the Ukrainian forces," he says. He's not wrong. Though Putin has been forced to divert troops away from some of Russia's offensives, it's still slowly gaining ground in Donetsk and other regions. The Institute for the Study of War highlighted this in late August, with its interactive maps showing that Russia has made some significant advances in Pokrovsk, which is a city in Donetsk that serves as a key logistical hub for Ukraine. As of August 28th, Russia has entered Memrik, which lies 18 miles from Pokrovsk, and it's slowly continuing to advance. Does that mean Ukraine's effort to divert Russian troops has failed? Not necessarily. Petraeus notes that this continued focus on Donetsk belies Putin's inability to create a proper response to the situation in Kursk. So far, not a particularly coherent response yet, the retired general says when talking about Putin's response. What the organizational architecture of this will eventually be is not yet clear to the observers out there. Eventually, they have to really push their forces against this to get the Ukrainians out of Russian territory. Putin knows this. His problem is that he can't come up with a clear plan that details the logistics of how Russia will achieve this and where the combat power will come from. The redeployment of 30,000 soldiers to Kursk may make it seem like Russia is mounting a powerful response, but that high number is deceiving. Putin has given Ukraine plenty of time to mount defenses, as well as cut off access to the regions it's already taken. It's already destroyed 2 bridges into Kursk, allowing it to create a buffer zone within Russian territory through which those 30,000 soldiers will need to navigate. And without the bridges that they would rely upon to get into Kursk, those soldiers are going to be far less effective than their numbers indicate. It again shows how relatively inadequate these Russian forces inside Russia actually are, Petraeus claims. Russia is sending all of its mainline forces into the offensive in the southeast and holding the line in the south. Again, these comments point to a collapse of the Russian military on its soil. Diverting 30,000 troops sounds impressive until you realize that this diversion will be less effective because of the time it's taken for Putin to create that response. It smacks of a leader dealing in desperation. He has been forced to recognize that Russia's internal forces can't stand up to a relatively small contingent of invading Ukrainians. Now he's stuck between a rock and a hard place, and he's mostly choosing to continue the Russian offensive in southeastern Ukraine. That decision may come back to bite him, as it opens the door for Ukraine to continue making gains in Kursk, all while fighting off the inexperienced and scattered troops that Putin is sending to retake the territory. That indecision could also mean that Russia is no longer in a position to end the Ukraine war on its own terms. It also shows that Ukraine is capable of doing something that the increasingly weakening Russian forces can't do: conduct complicated advances. Throughout the war, we've seen the same pattern in Putin's strategy. Rather than relying on the combined might of his aerial and ground forces to conduct cooperative strikes against Ukrainian positions, he has simply bombarded these positions with artillery while sending soldier after soldier into them. Putin has created a meat grinder. We saw this during the Battle of Bakhmut, which lasted a year and at one point saw Russia losing around 820 soldiers per day. Its loss tally by the end of the battle was around 30,000, a heavy price to pay for taking a fairly small city of just 16.1 square miles. With the Kursk invasion, Ukraine has taken well over 20 times that amount of territory in less than a month, with barely any losses being recorded on its side. Part of the reason for that comes down to what Petraeus mentioned regarding Russia using recently assigned conscripts to guard its borders. However, Global Guardian intelligence analyst Joe Chaffetz says that there's another reason. If nothing else, Kyiv's foray into Kursk has demonstrated that Ukrainian forces are capable of complicated mechanized advances, he told USA Today. Continuing to use that strategy could allow Ukraine to replicate the Kursk success inside Russia, enabling it to take more territory. And in doing so, Ukraine could even thwart Putin's strategy of making incremental and irreversible advances. The meat grinder approach would have to end, and Putin would be forced to focus on more complex tactics. Given that Russia has already lost around 613,500 soldiers as of producing this video, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, and is set to lose many more, that need to match Ukraine's complex tactics creates a problem. Russia's military may not have the expertise needed, especially after losing so many combat veterans. So its collapse may come partially as a result of ineptitude and inexperience, rather than simply no longer having the manpower. Petraeus' comments ended with his pointing out how inadequate Russia's forces are. That alone could be taken as a sign of impending collapse of the Russian military. However, there are other issues at play. Take the psychological impact this invasion could have on Russia and its military as an example. Before the war in Ukraine began, Russia was feared the world over as having one of the world's strongest militaries. This was an image that Putin was more than happy to play up, not least because it fed into the image of the strongman, authoritarian leader that's enabled him to hold on to power in Russia for over 20 years. However, even before the Kursk invasion, Russia's efforts in Ukraine had revealed it to be something of a paper tiger. Yes, it can withstand a lot of punishment, but each of its attacks leads to severe losses, with those lost soldiers being replaced by contracted mercenaries or poorly trained conscripts. Now, those paper tiger accusations have intensified, given how easily Ukraine entered Kursk. Beyond having a strong impact on Ukrainian morale, that incursion has to be damaging to Russia's military and, in particular, how Putin's people view his ability to defend his countrymen. The early signs of a decline in confidence are already coming in the wake of the Kursk invasion. Speaking to CBC in Canada, a Ukrainian soldier who wished only to be identified by his codename of Wolverine spoke about his experiences with Russians in Kursk following his taking part in the invasion. In addition to pointing out how good the capture of Russian territory was for Ukrainian morale, Wolverine noted that many of the Russian soldiers and people he came across seemed disillusioned. They speak about betrayal from the Russian government, Wolverine told CBC. They did not declare evacuation and immediately turned off water and light, so they created unbearable living conditions. In other words, Putin started treating Kursk like a war zone without really thinking about its people. Granted, the evacuation orders eventually came, with around 200,000 of the oblast's residents now having been moved on, but those early days of the Kursk invasion revealed a lot to the people living in the region. They showed that Putin had underestimated his Ukrainian foe, and that he didn't have a plan in place to help his people if they were ever in danger. Earlier, we spoke about Putin's strongman image and how it's essential to the leadership of his people and military. That image relies on Putin being able to demonstrate that he can lead Russia to greater things and that, crucially, he can protect Russia from any external threat. The Kursk invasion shook that belief, to the point where many Russians will now be doubting Putin's leadership. What does that have to do with Petraeus' comments about the Russian military crumbling? Lowering opinions of Putin damaged a collective Russian morale that was already a problem before the Kursk invasion. In March 2014, the Forum for Ukrainian Studies published a piece in which it noted that one of Putin's main military strategies appears to be to lower Ukrainian morale via the maximization of Russia's material and manpower advantages. The idea is to use constant pressure to bear down on Ukraine. Only now the situation has been flipped. Ukraine's soldiers are in Russia. Their morale is higher than it's been for a long time. Meanwhile, Russian soldiers have been struggling with morale crises since the Ukraine war turned into a conflict of attrition. Putin has been recruiting people who never wanted to be in the war in the first place. Desertions and post-abandonments are rife, with over 18,000 Russian troops abandoning the country's southern military district in April 2024 alone. Pressure is now being placed on Putin and his military. Morale is key in war. It affects a soldier's ability to engage in combat operations, in addition to affecting commanders and their ability to organize their troops. How can you coordinate an attack or a defense when you're having to deal with soldiers deserting daily? By failing to stop the Kursk invasion and then being slow to respond to it, Putin has placed even greater strain on a collective Russian military morale that was already close to the breaking point. So Russia's military crumbling may end up being less a direct result of it being further stretched by the Ukrainian advance, and more a result of its soldiers simply losing their appetite for a fight that was never meant to last this long in the first place. Psychologically, Russia's military can no longer view itself as one of the world's strongest. It's failed to take Ukraine after 2.5 years of trying. Any advances it makes in Ukraine are slow and come at the cost of thousands of lives. And now Russian civilians are having to deal with the war being brought to their doorstep. Add all of this to the points Petraeus made about Ukraine using its troops in Russia to cut off vital supply lines and the region itself, and you have a collection of issues that ruin the Russian psyche. Putin can no longer position himself as the strongman defender of Russia. And with the loss of that positioning may come the loss of support of the Russian military, along with the country's people and any of Russia's elite who may come sniffing around Putin's seat of power. Let's come back to Petraeus' comments about Russian military inadequacy. The general made those comments in the context of Russia's internal defenses, pointing out that the use of inexperienced conscripts as border guards and defensive lines within Russia played a large part in Ukraine's Kursk successes. Those inexperienced soldiers couldn't stand up to the far more combat-hardened Ukrainians they came up against, leading to the massive volume of surrenders we're seeing during this incursion. That inadequacy is the result of a larger problem in Russia's military that's causing it to crumble from the inside: terrible training. In May 2023, Newsweek reported on a British intelligence assessment which said that Russia's ground forces in Ukraine mostly consisted of poorly trained, mobilized reservists who were becoming increasingly reliant on antiquated equipment. The situation was so bad, according to the report, that Russia's combined grouping of forces, which numbered 200,000 at the time, was only capable of completing very simple infantry-based operations. We've seen that throughout the war. Every Russian gain has come as a result of Putin throwing people at a Ukrainian position, sacrificing thousands in the process, while he fails to bring Russia's superior aerial might to bear. Joint operations are limited and usually reduced to launching bombs and artillery at a position, followed up by soldiers, which is an antiquated tactic. CNA points out that these training problems have long existed in Russia's military. It says these issues exist for many reasons, ranging from procedural rigidity and, as the British pointed out, a lack of access to proper equipment. However, it also notes a lack of standardization, a result, it says, of an emphasis on in-house training within units. In other words, much of a Russian soldier's training takes place once they have already been deployed. That's fine in a peaceful scenario, as the new soldier has time to learn the ropes, but when Russia is in an active war, this focus on in-unit training inevitably leads to barely trained conscripts being put into positions they're nowhere near ready enough to handle. That's what happened in Kursk. But it's happening in Ukraine as well, with this poor training playing a huge role in Russia experiencing as many losses as it has. Think about what this means for Russia's military in the future. Putin has already lost over 600,000 soldiers if Ukraine's Ministry of Finance has accurate figures, which likely means he's already lost most of the experienced troops he initially sent into Ukraine. Those experienced soldiers are being followed up by poorly trained infantry who don't have the time to learn the ropes in the traditional Russian way, resulting in even more losses. Internally, Russia is defending itself with conscripts as young as 19 years old who have no chance of contending with a Ukraine that's capable of far more complex combat operations. Perhaps that inexperience is part of the reason why the coherent Russian response to the Kursk incursion Petraeus mentions hasn't come yet. Putin can't trust his poorly trained soldiers to put up an adequate defense. Before the Kursk invasion, Putin was getting away with this poor training. Russia faced no threat on its soil, so Putin could conscript, contract, and cajole people into being fed into the Ukraine war meat grinder because his tactic was to destroy morale with a constant flood of manpower. Now the situation is different. Russia is having to defend itself while it attacks, and as Petraeus points out, we're already seeing the signs of a Russian collapse. Mass surrenders in the face of Ukrainian invaders, the pushing of troops from other locations into Russia to mount a response weakened the Russian front line elsewhere. Combine this stretching of manpower with prominent training issues and quickly declining Russian morale, and you have all of the ingredients of an incoming military collapse. That collapse may come as a result of Ukraine's pressure in Kursk. It may even come because Putin's people no longer trust him to be the strong man they need to defend them. But make no mistake about it, the collapse is coming. At least that's according to General Petraeus. But what do you think about the state of Russia's military today, and what the future may hold for Putin's forces? Is talk about a collapse a touch ambitious, or is Russia heading toward a fall? Russia's weapons production has increased dramatically. Russia's defense industry gears up for a long war. The scale of Russia's rearmament has NATO worried. These are just some of the headlines that flooded the internet as Russia's weapons industry saw a boom in 2024 instead of the doom many Western experts had predicted. Of course, no one can fault the writers behind these articles, as one look at the figures coming out of Moscow paints a picture of a thriving war machine that has made an almost miraculous recovery. Factories running at full tilt, assembly lines churning out artillery shells, tanks, and missiles at an unprecedented pace. In the artillery department, Russia has even bested the US, producing about 250,000 shells per month, which is nearly 3 times the quantity the US produces for Ukraine, and that's combined with Europe. However, beneath the glossy reports and the numbers that seem to defy expectations, whispers of resource shortages, outdated technology, and rampant corruption tell a far different story. Russia's weapons industry might have been propped up by sheer force of will and held together by desperate measures and hollow propaganda, but it is, in fact, teetering on the edge of collapse. And the truth is that this industry was always going to fail, no matter how much the Kremlin tried to mask its decay. After all, no empire can thrive on rotting foundations. But why is Russia's weapons industry failing so badly, and what deeper forces are driving it toward inevitable collapse? Keep watching to find out. To understand just how different reality is from what's being portrayed, let's look at the propaganda coming from the Kremlin, and then gradually peel back its layers and examine the crumbling foundations of Russia's weapons industry. According to the Kremlin, Russia's weapons industry has never been stronger. The historic increase in Russia's military expenditure alone should serve as proof. In 2022, Russia adopted an expenditure plan that allocates $600 billion for national defense, security, and law enforcement between 2022 and 25. About $75 billion was planned for 2022 and $84 billion for 2023. In 2024, a record-high pre-planned military expenditure was introduced, with reports pointing to a $140 billion figure. This would mean that 35% of all government spending in 2024 was directed toward fueling the military machine. an enormous commitment that, on the surface, signals Russia's determination to sustain its military power. With all this money pouring into the defense sector, it shouldn't be surprising that the official data on arms production, coming from the Kremlin, also paints a picture of tremendous success. According to Russia's Ministry of Digital Development, Communications and Mass Media, in 2023 alone, the production of armored vehicles in Russia increased threefold. For drones, it increased twofold. In communications equipment, weapons, electronic warfare, and reconnaissance, more than fivefold growth. Those were the exact words of Russia's Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin at a meeting discussing the needs of Russia's armed forces. He added that the volume of production of armor protection items also increased threefold, which was good news for all the Russian soldiers, fearing they would be sent into battle, ill-equipped and vulnerable, like many of their predecessors in the conflict. To keep up with these intense production volumes, the Kremlin has reportedly engaged over 360 enterprises, commissioning approximately 37,000 units of various equipment. This has allowed another 520,000 employees to be involved in the defense sector, pushing the limits of production capacity. The result, Russia's weapons industry is not only fulfilling its quotas, but it's doing so ahead of schedule. That's if you believe a word of the official reports coming from the Kremlin. Remember, that's the same Kremlin that presented mind-blowing figures regarding mass mobilization in Russia. 137,000 troops in August of 2022, another 170,000 soldiers in December of 2023, and plans to mobilize another 400,000 before 2024 ends. On paper, all these figures paint a picture of an unstoppable and ever-growing military force. Yet beneath the surface of these impressive numbers lies a different story, one of poorly chosen, poorly equipped, and poorly supported troops used by the Kremlin as nothing more than cannon fodder. Older people, disabled people, convicts. These are just some of the groups conscripted to swell the ranks, revealing a disturbing reality behind the grandiose figures. Russia's weapons industry is no different. However, to be fair, Russia's approach of quantity over quality has allowed the defense industry to flood the battlefield with an impressive array of weaponry, ammunition, and equipment. As for how these performed on the battlefield, that's a story for later. Strictly numbers-wise, the Ukrainian battlefield is expected to see the following equipment in 2024. 800,000 units of 122mm ammunition for barrel artillery, 500,000 122mm rockets for the BM-21 Grad multiple launch rocket system, 17,000 200mm rockets for the BM-27 Uragan self-propelled multiple launch rocket system, 1,500 tanks, and 3,000 other armored vehicles. These figures become even more concerning when compared to those from previous years. For instance, only 33,122mm rockets for the BM-21 were manufactured in 2023, which means that their production is expected to skyrocket by 1,415%. Again, that's if you choose to believe the Kremlin-controlled figures. We must keep emphasizing where these figures are coming from, as it's pretty easy to get lost in all the numbers, also losing sight of their reliability. As previously noted, the Kremlin's numbers serve a single purpose: to bolster a narrative of strength while disregarding deeper issues like quality control and inefficiency. But is projecting power the only reason why Russia is seemingly putting all its resources into weapons production? In a word, no. The truth is that Russia needs the weapons industry to survive. Even before the war in Ukraine started, Russia was incapable of exporting other high-value-added products like cars or cell phones. Weapons have always been a cornerstone of Russia's export industry, which was spearheaded by oil and gas exports. But now, when most of the world wants nothing to do with Russian goods and natural resources due to sanctions and geopolitical tensions, weapons are practically all Russia has. As of 2024, Russia's defense industry employs an estimated 3.5 million people, which accounts for 20% of all manufacturing jobs in Russia. All the tanks, planes, and ammunition manufactured, together with military pay and compensation for dead and wounded soldiers, directly contribute to Russia's gross domestic product, or GDP figures. In other words, the war in Ukraine is single-handedly driving Russia's economic growth. But what about arms exports? Are the weapons production figures reflecting a booming export sector as well? The answer is a resounding no. However, the reason behind this answer is multifaceted. On one hand, Russia can't afford to sell virtually any weapons, as it needs all its production for its own military needs. With the ongoing conflict in Ukraine depleting resources and driving up demand for armaments, the domestic priority is to ensure that the Russian military is well equipped and has ample supplies. This is especially vital when you consider the billions of dollars Ukraine is receiving from its Western allies in military aid. On the other hand, even if Russia wanted to sell weapons in bulk, it wouldn't be able to. Why? Because hardly anyone would rush to buy them. But how is this possible? After all, we're talking about the producer of arguably the most famous assault rifle in the world, the AK-47. The country that, alongside the US and France, contributed to nearly 2/3 of the global major weapons exports between 2019 and 2023. Well, you see, once your weapons actually get battle-tested, while the whole world is watching and fail spectacularly, their reputation can tarnish rather quickly. And that's on top of the sanctions that reduced the number of countries purchasing major Russian arms from 31 in 2019 to 12 in 2023. Among these countries, India and China lead the pack, with $5 and $3.1 billion respectively, according to data acquired between 2019 and 23. However, even these two major importers significantly reduced the amount of weapons they purchased from Russia in 2023. For comparison's sake, India imported $405 million worth of major weapons in 2023, a 62.5% decrease from the $1.08 billion spent in 2022. Similarly, China spent $372 million on Russia's weapons and equipment in 2023, while their imports almost reached $600 million in 2022, $580 million to be exact. So how poorly do Russia's weapons have to have performed in order to keep these other countries away? The answer is glaringly obvious in the field. Even during the first year of war in Ukraine, when the weapons used were supposed to be new and fresh, showcasing Russian military prowess, the country's equipment saw some excessively high failure rates. Take Russian missiles as an example. According to the Pentagon, these missiles experienced 20 to 60% failure rates in the first month of the conflict alone. In this context, failure was defined as the inability to successfully launch the missile or hit the target intended. Out of these faulty missiles, cruise missiles performed the worst, with air-launched cruise missiles having the lowest kill rates. There have even been reports that some of the roughly 1,100 missiles Russia launched in the first month of the invasion managed to hit the target but forgot about the other crucial part, actually exploding. The Pentagon explained this phenomenon as a result of both quality control issues and fusing problems. Still in their March 25, 2022 report, the Pentagon officials warned Russia still had about 50% of their missile inventory available. And despite the high failure rates and performance issues observed, such a high amount of the remaining stockpile still represented a substantial threat. Well, by May 10th of that year, this threat all but vanished, as the Pentagon reported that Russia had almost depleted its missile inventory. Unsurprisingly, Russia was no longer eager to shoot off what little remained left and right, given the abysmal performance and dwindling stockpile. So the missile use continued at a significantly reduced rate. Now the performance of the Russian missiles is disastrous in and of itself. However, it reaches a whole new level when you consider all the praises the Russian military lavished upon their missile technology before the conflict. Former Deputy Prime Minister, now the Director General of the State Corporation for Space Activities, Roscosmos, Yuri Borisov, described Russia's hypersonic missiles as high precision, claiming that they can be used to eliminate enemy targets such as parked vehicles, arms depots, command posts, infrastructure targets, with the error probability of just a few meters. He added that these missiles, primarily referring to the likes of the Bal, Bastion, Iskander, Kalibr, KH-101 and Kinzhal missiles, can travel hundreds of kilometers and have next to zero CEP. CEP refers to circular error probability, which measures the radius within which a missile is expected to land around its target, indicating its precision. So a missile with a CEP that's close to zero is supposed to always hit its intended target with remarkable accuracy. However, the war in Ukraine proved that these praises were nothing more than wishful thinking. Although, to be fair, even pre-war reports had hinted at the possibility that Russia's missiles might not live up to their lofty claims. For example, in 2017, Igor Rosin, a Russian military journalist, reviewed Russia's most devastating sea, ground and air missiles. When talking about the Kalibr naval cruise missile, he said that it had an accuracy of 30 meters, which is roughly 100 feet. When discussing the KH-101 air-based missiles, he described them as being able to eliminate targets up to 5,500 kilometers or 3,400 miles away with an accuracy of 5 to 50 meters, which is 16 to 164 feet. Now, 5 meters might not be too much, but 50 is certainly quite far from the supposed near-zero CEP. In fact, 50 meters is not even close to the precision needed for high-value targets. This sort of expectation versus reality gap is, without a doubt, one of the leading reasons why Russia's weapons industry is failing so badly. However, it's far from the only one. With this in mind, let's dive into the factors contributing to the downfall of the Russian defense sector. To start, let's expand on the first reason we mentioned. Russia's weapons in practice simply can't match the expectations on paper, which has led most of the country's arms importers to rethink their purchases. Even if you know a little about the technicalities of weaponry, think about it logically. How did a country once touted as the second biggest military power in the world fail to quickly defeat Ukraine, a nation with drastically fewer resources and a smaller military? Russia's propaganda was so effective that even Western commentators saw Kyiv falling rather quickly. After all, Russia's claims and previous military actions, like its swift victory in Georgia, mighty intervention in Syria, and its aggressive posture in Crimea, had set a precedent for rapid success. But let's look underneath the surface. At 26,900 square miles of area, Georgia is a tiny country, almost 10 times smaller than Ukraine. Plus, at the time of Russia's invasion in 2008, it had a minuscule army of under 30,000, which was additionally poorly organized. As for Syria, Russia was up against a fragmented opposition rather than a unified, well-organized military force. That's not to mention that the Syrian insurgents' air capabilities were almost non-existent, and practically all Russia did in the country was launch airstrikes. According to Valery Gerasimov, the Chief of General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, the country's air force, RUAF, had delivered 71,000 strikes on the supposed terrorist infrastructure in under a year and a half. Finally, in Crimea, the situation was markedly different as well. The annexation in 2014 was largely unopposed, characterized by a swift, well-coordinated operation that relied heavily on local support and covert tactics rather than a full-scale military engagement. The Ukrainian forces in Crimea were relatively few, between 5,000 and 22,000, and lacked the capability to mount a significant defense against the Russian forces, which were able to leverage both military superiority and the element of surprise effectively. In other words, the combat conditions encountered by the Russian military in Ukraine were far more challenging than they had previously experienced. For the first time, the Russian military actually had to rely on its full array of conventional forces in a prolonged and high-intensity conflict against a well-organized and determined adversary. This exposed the limitations of Russia's weaponry, tactics, and logistical support that had previously been masked by less demanding scenarios. That's why Russia failed on almost every front in Ukraine. It failed to claim any substantial victories, make and maintain significant territorial gains, achieve air supremacy, defend its naval assets in the Black Sea against a country with no navy, land, air, sea, fail, fail, fail. With this in mind, why would any serious prospective buyer want to invest in Russian weaponry that's proven ineffective in a high-stakes conflict? The failures of the Russian military across multiple fronts not only undermine its own capabilities, but also cast doubt on the reliability of its arms. But let's take the buyers out of the mix. Let's say Russia is strictly producing weapons to sustain its war efforts and thus its economy. Even by these standards, Russia's weapons industry would still be considered a failure. Why? Because its products simply cannot match the sophisticated Western arms. And since countering and even surpassing Western weaponry is a key objective for Russia, it's easy to conclude that it's all for nothing. All the pompous claims, grand military parades, and inflated statistics mean nothing when Russia's weapons industry ultimately falls short of producing large-scale targeting systems, precision-guided munitions, and heavy strike long-range drones. Take the Sukhoi Su-57 stealth fighter jet as an example. This project was initiated back in 1999 under the guise of a revolutionary advancement in stealth and multi-role capabilities. Marketed as Russia's answer to the Western Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II, the Su-57 promised to deliver unparalleled superiority with its stealth features, advanced avionics, and supersonic cruise capabilities. And then over 20 years passed, and all Russia had to show for these ambitious promises was a handful of Su-57 prototypes. In December 2019, just a year before the aircraft would be officially launched, the first serial Su-57, bort number 01 Blue, crashed some 70 miles from the Zyomgy airport in Khabarovsk Krai during the final stage of its factory trials. The reason? A control system malfunctioned at an altitude of 26,000 feet. As a result of the malfunction, the aircraft entered a rapid spiral descent, causing the pilot to eject at an altitude of about 6,500 feet. This crash was emblematic of the broader challenges facing Russia's defense industry, where ambitious projects frequently struggle to deliver on their lofty promises. For an aircraft that was supposed to rival the best Western fighters, the Su-57's troubled development and operational hiccups illustrate the gap between Russia's aspirations and its practical achievements in defense technology. To this day, only 22 serial Su-57 jets have been manufactured, and reports have yet to come out about their operation in a real combat scenario. In contrast, the US has built over 1,000 F-35s, which are actively used and tested in various theaters of operation around the world. However, as much as Russia wants to beat its Western opponents, one simple fact remains true. The country's weapons industry is failing miserably without Western-made parts. As Foreign Policy puts it, Russia's war machine runs on Western parts. Now you might wonder, how is this possible if over 50 countries, including most of Western nations, imposed sanctions on Russia? Well, Russia has managed to find a workaround, relying on a network of third-party countries and intermediaries to source the crucial components they need. This has led to multiple calls to increase funding for oversight agencies and punish those who facilitate these indirect transactions with multi-billion-dollar penalties similar to those issued to banks for money laundering and terrorist financing. This also means Russia's weapons industry is practically running out of time, and in a high-stakes game, time is of the essence. The increasing difficulty in acquiring critical components will likely eventually force Russia to either drastically reduce its production capabilities or seek alternative methods to bolster its defense sector, with both options posing significant challenges to the survival of Russia's weapons industry and, thus, economy. But how dependent on Western components is Russia's arms production truly? Unique 2023 Ukrainian resources titled Components in the Aggressor's Weapon and Instruments of War hold the answer to this question. That answer is 3,638 different Western components in 134 distinct weapon systems. In other words, Russia's military is about 70 to 90% dependent on Western-made parts. Take the Shahed 238 unmanned aerial vehicle, or UAV for short, as an example. With the help of Iran, their source country, Russia has started producing these drones domestically, aiming to manufacture at least 6,000 units by the end of 2025. To achieve this goal, Russia will need electronic components from Western and other foreign countries like Canada, China, Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and the US. Even when Russia tries to deploy new types of weapons, such as the Kh-69 and Zircon missiles, they can't do it without Western-made components. In fact, these systems require even more sophisticated and specialized technologies that can only be sourced from Western nations. Therefore, finding a way to fully prevent Russia from accessing Western-made components would undoubtedly spell doom for the country's arms production. For now, Russia's still getting away with sourcing Western-made counterparts, with a June 2024 report by the Royal United Services Institute, a London-based think tank, disclosing, despite the diligent efforts of many civil servants, backed by the political will to disrupt Russia's military-industrial output, there is little to show for it. However, even the little damage that Western sanctions have done to Russia shouldn't be underestimated. Sweeping Western sanctions have undoubtedly pushed Russia's weapons industry to the brink of collapse, although they did fail to push it over entirely. As a result of these sanctions, the Russian military-industrial complex is facing severe delays, rampant costs, and substantial operational inefficiencies. The result? The Russians have been cutting corners more and more, jeopardizing the long-term quality of the weapons they produce. So in 2024, it might seem that Russia has managed to outwit its Western adversaries through sheer volume of production, but most of the weapons being produced in heaps in Russian factories have virtually no chance of maintaining the standards necessary for modern warfare. Not now, not ever. But Western sanctions aren't the only ones to blame for the abysmal output of Russian arms factories. How the Kremlin treats its factory workers also has something to do with it. Remember, we're talking about the same Kremlin that's favored the meat grinder military strategy throughout the duration of the war in Ukraine, sending wave after wave of soldiers with little regard for their survival or well-being. And if that's how the Kremlin treats frontline soldiers, the very people tasked with achieving military victories, just imagine how it treats the factory workers behind the scenes. Sure, these factory workers are well paid, with machinists and welders reportedly earning more than white-collar managers and lawyers in Russia. However, Russia's soldiers are also well paid, and yet they are still treated as expendable assets. In arms production, this means introducing 6-day work weeks with 12-hour shifts, rushing employees through the training process, and even resorting to forced labor to meet the deadlines. For instance, Kurgan-Mashevod, the Russian manufacturing facility producing the BMP-2 and BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, has brought in convicts to fill the labor shortages. These prisoners, often with little to no experience, are thrown into the production process under grueling conditions, all in the name of speeding up output. However, it's important to note that the responsibility for these cruel actions doesn't lie solely with the management. The Russian government was the one to crank up the pressure, with Dmitry Medvedev, former president and current deputy chairman of the Security Council of Russia, touring the factory in 2022 and warning the management about the potential criminal charges that come with failing to meet production deadlines. Medvedev's message was clear: the Kremlin demanded results, regardless of the human cost. This leads us to the underlying reason why Russia's weapons industry is on the verge of collapse, and why this was always going to be its fate: the systematic challenges embedded within its military-industrial complex. Simply put, this complex is failing due to a deeply flawed system of state-run monopolies, corruption, and inefficiencies. This systemic failure is rooted in Russia's resistance to embrace free market capitalism, which has stunted innovation and productivity in the defense sector. On one side, the US maintains a partnership between the government and private companies. For instance, Washington renewed its fighter jet fleet through a competitive bidding process, awarding the F-35 contract to Lockheed Martin after an open contest with private companies like Boeing. Sure, this system has its own drawbacks, including cost overruns of $400 billion seen in the F-35 program. However, it's also driven the US to produce some of the most advanced weaponry in the world. Decades of competition among private arms firms have incentivized innovation and efficiency, leading to cutting-edge technologies like stealth fighters, precision-guided missiles, and drones. And then there's Russia, a country where the defense industry operates strictly under state monopolies and centralization, continuing a legacy from the Soviet era. Communism might have fallen a long time ago, but Russia has certainly not embraced free market principles. Instead, the state maintains control over most industries, including defense, through massive conglomerates like Rostec, established in 2007 to consolidate over 700 arms companies. The logic behind Rostec was to eliminate inefficiencies through centralized control, but this has only compounded the problem. Now there are more inefficiencies in Russia's weapons industry than ever before. This also has to do with the people put in charge of the country's defense industry. Instead of fostering competition, Russia's President Vladimir Putin's approach was to replace communist ideologues with pragmatic technocrats, or siloviki, who are mostly ex-KGB agents just like him. Of course, this includes the CEO of Rostec, Sergei Kamazov, who is a former KGB colleague of Putin. By 2014, Rostec had reduced its workforce to 443,000 employees from 788,000 in 2008. However, despite these cuts, Rostec managed to achieve an even greater monopolization of the defense sector. For example, the United Aircraft Corporation, under Rostec's control, is the only manufacturer of Russian fighter jets. In the US, on the other hand, there's a diverse array of contractors like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Raytheon. Another glaring example of inefficiency within Russia's military-industrial complex is Almaz-Antey, Russia's leading missile manufacturer. This corporation is directly owned by Russia's Ministry of Finance and led by another Silovik, Viktor Ivanov. In 2017, its subsidiary, MPO Novator, managed to produce only 60-caliber missiles in 6 months, an abysmally low output, given that Russia fired over 1,200 missiles in just 1 month of the Ukraine war. This mismatch between production capacity and battlefield needs reveals the inability of Russia's monopolistic defense industry to meet modern demands. However, no systematic challenge has plagued every aspect of Russian society like corruption. And there's no doubt about it, corruption and cronyism also permeate every inch of the military-industrial complex. That's how the late Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin's former ally, and his catering company were appointed to provide food to Russian soldiers, bypassing traditional systems. And that's how the same Russian soldiers ended up with expired food while risking their lives for their country. According to Russia's former Minister of Foreign Affairs Andrei Kozyrevin, corruption, paired with the fear of actually telling Putin about it, has transformed Russia's military into a Potemkin military. If you're unfamiliar with the term, Potemkin military refers to a military force that, on the surface, appears formidable and well-prepared, but is hollow and dysfunctional in reality. The term originates from Grigory Potemkin, a Russian nobleman who supposedly built fake villages along the route of Empress Catherine the Great's journey to Crimea to impress her with the region's prosperity. And that's all Russia's weapons industry is, a carefully constructed facade that's beginning to crumble. And let us tell you, once this facade finally caves in, it will take the Russian economy with it. After all, this economy is now fully militarized, and much of its industrial capacity is dedicated to defense production. While the defense sector falters, the effects will ripple through the entire economic system. Renaud Foucault, a senior lecturer in economics at Lancaster University, perhaps put it best: Russia's economy is now completely driven by the war in Ukraine. It cannot afford to lose, but nor can it afford to win. If Russia achieves victory, the staggering costs associated with rebuilding and maintaining control over a conquered Ukraine would be insurmountable for an already weakened economy. Conversely, if Russia loses, it risks not only the collapse of its military-industrial complex, but also the loss of the very driving force behind its economic stability and growth. Now it's time for you to do the talking. Head to the comments section below and let us know whether you believe doom is the only option for Russia's weapons industry. And if so, how long do you think it will take before this complex collapses under the weight of its decay? It has been dubbed the largest missile and drone strike against Ukraine so far. On August 26, 2024, while still licking his wounds following the humiliation of the Kursk invasion, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered a concentrated missile and drone attack that struck several cities in Ukraine. ABC News called it a nightmare strike that targeted 15 regions in the country, with Russia launching at least 127 missiles and 109 drones during an 8-hour attack. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky labeled the attack dastardly, while pointing out that Russia was once again using its missiles and drones to hit civilian infrastructure. By the end of the strike, at least 7 people were dead and another 47 injured, with 4 of those 47 being children, according to Ukraine's state emergency service. Still, it could have all been so much worse. The reason it wasn't is that Ukraine was able to defend against this missile and drone attack, not only with the air defense systems it's used since the beginning of Putin's special military operation, but with a weapons platform that Zelensky has long said Ukraine needed. A weapons system that's capable of shooting cruise missiles out of the sky and over time may help to put Ukraine on a more even footing with Russia in the aerial battle. We're talking about the F-16. As well as being the day in which Russia launched its largest missile and drone strike against Ukraine, August 26th also marked the first time that Ukraine used F-16s to fight against Russia. In this video, we're going to provide a full analysis of how Ukraine used its new multi-role fighters, what its plans for the F-16s are likely to be in the future, and the challenges it still faces in establishing any form of aerial superiority over Russia. But first, a recap. Since the beginning of the war, Zelensky has argued that American-made F-16s could play a huge role in helping Ukraine turn the tide. The planes, he believed, would allow Ukraine to create small pockets of air superiority over Russia's enemy, particularly when used as part of combined ground operations, as Ukraine attempts to seize back territory Russia had snatched from it. But Zelensky was made to wait, and wait. In July 2023, several countries including Norway, Denmark, Belgium and the Netherlands formed a fighter jet coalition through which they pledged to deliver 85 F-16s to Ukraine. That might give you the impression that Ukraine received these fighter jets in 2023, but that wasn't the case. Before those planes could be sent to Ukraine, its pilots needed to undergo an extensive training program to learn how to use them. After all, these are pilots who have traditionally used older Soviet-era platforms, such as the MiG-29, and it would take them months to get up to speed on the F-16. The American multi-role fighter traditionally has a training program that lasts for 18 months. Even with that training being fast-tracked into a 6-month program, it would still be a long time after the coalition commitment was made before the F-16s would arrive in Ukraine. "It's been 18 months and the planes have not reached us," Zelensky proclaimed in July 2024, adding that he believed having F-16s would help Ukraine to unblock the skies over his country. The good news for Zelensky was that he wouldn't have to wait much longer to get his hands on F-16s. On August 4, 2024, Zelensky stood at an unnamed airbase in Ukraine, flanked by 2 of the first batch of 6 F-16s the country had received. "F-16s in Ukraine, we did it," he said during the ceremony, in which he thanked the coalition leaders who had made this possible while stressing that Ukraine would need many more. Those extra F-16s will come. It's believed Ukraine will have received 20 of them by the end of 2024, with another 65 waiting in the wings. But these first 6 will go some way to boosting Ukraine's air force so it can move away from the old Soviet systems upon which it's been forced to rely. Fast forward a little over 3 weeks and we arrive at August 26th and Russia's nightmare missile and drone attack. It was time for the F-16s to show what they could do. Sandbox News provided details about how Ukraine is using its F-16s in its August 27th report on Russia's missile and drone strike. It noted that of the 127 missiles and 109 drones that Russia sent to Ukraine, the vast majority were intercepted or shot down before they reached their targets. Ultimately, 102 Russian missiles were downed, along with 99 of the 109 drones. Ukrainian anti-air defenses were credited with the majority of these interceptions, but Sandbox claims that reports were coming in that Ukraine had deployed its F-16s for the first time, with those multi-role fighters taking part in a defensive effort that saw them shoot down several cruise missiles that were on their way to Kyiv and other locations. From there, the report became more speculative. Sandbox revealed that it wasn't known how many of its F-16s Ukraine had deployed in this defensive role, or exactly what types of missiles the planes had shot down. It notes that it's very unlikely that the F-16s were used to take out ballistic missiles, such as the Iskander-M, as their flight profiles make them difficult for the F-16 to counter. Instead, Sandbox says, it's much more likely that these F-16s played a part in taking down the bevy of surface and air-launched cruise missiles that Russia threw into Ukraine. It points to the Russian Kh-101 and K-59, both of which it says operates more like tactical aircraft than ballistic missiles when they're in the sky. These missiles are powered by jet engines, similar to those used in older jets, giving them a heat signature for the F-16's missile systems to track. Because of those jet engines, the missiles also fly at lower altitudes and take a more horizontal flight path than ballistic missiles. However, the fact that they top out at speeds of between 600 and 700 miles per hour means they have no real means of defending themselves against a fighter jet that can fly faster and track them via their engines. Add to this that Ukraine has already revealed that the F-16s they've been showing off were seemingly loaded with air-to-air munitions, such as AIM-120B missiles and Sidewinder missiles capable of using infrared targeting, and it's clear that Ukraine intended to use its new planes as air defense assets. That's precisely what it appears to have done during Russia's extensive missile and drone attack, with the F-16s being used to take out cruise missiles, while Ukraine's other ground-based anti-air defenses focused on the ballistic missiles and drones. Sandbox says it's most likely that Ukraine was using AIM-9M Sidewinders, which have a range of around 10 miles, meaning any plane firing them would have to get up close and personal with a target. Given that F-16s can fly at speeds of up to 1,345 miles per hour, as well as reaching cruising speeds of 577 miles per hour, it's very feasible that Ukraine used them to track, catch, and then obliterate these types of Russian cruise missiles Sandbox notes were used in the attack. It's even possible, though perhaps unlikely, that Ukraine took advantage of the M61 Vulcan 20mm rotary cannon built into the F-16. These 6-barrel cannons can rattle off an impressive 7,200 rounds per minute, with the caveat being that they're only really effective when the F-16 is within 2,000 feet of its target. They may have been used, though they would have required a pilot to get very close to a cruise missile, creating the risk of a debris cloud upon contact that could damage the F-16. Still, from all of this, we gain some insight into how Ukraine is using its F-16s. This initial batch, at least, appears to be a supplement to the country's aerial defenses. The F-16s weren't deployed on or behind the front lines and have yet to be used by Ukraine in combined efforts with ground-based soldiers. Instead, they're taking out missiles intended for targets on the ground in Ukraine, with their likely focus being to take out cruise missiles that Ukraine's ground-based anti-air systems can't track. A second missile and drone attack, launched just 2 days after the Nightmare attack, offered more insight. Sadly, it also showed just how much risk an F-16 pilot takes whenever they climb into the cockpit. According to a report by the Task and Purpose YouTube channel, Russia launched a second missile volley at Ukraine on August 29th. This one wasn't as large as the Nightmare attack, as it involved just 5 missiles and 74 drones fired at Ukrainian power generation facilities. However, Ukraine responded by sending an F-16 to take out as much as it could. That's when tragedy struck. The F-16 sent to take out the missiles and drones was piloted by Colonel Alexei Mess, who Politico says had long been a fervent advocate of delivering advanced fighter jets to Ukraine. On August 29th, Mess, who went by the handle Moonfish, was piloting one of those very jets during an aerial battle that saw him tackling the Russian missile and drone assault. He didn't make it. In a statement released by the Ukrainian Army General Staff, it was revealed that Moonfish had enjoyed some early success against the Russian missiles, shooting down 4 of them using his F-16's airborne weapons. Following that success, Moonfish, who was one of the first Ukrainian pilots to qualify to fly an F-16, encountered difficulties. During the approach to the next target, contact with one of the aircraft was lost. As it turned out later, the plane crashed. The pilot died, read the statement. Ukraine has yet to confirm if Moonfish was shot down or whether it was issues related to pilot or mechanical errors that led to his F-16 crashing. Whatever the case may be, the sad fact for Ukraine is that it's lost both a good pilot and one of the 6 F-16s it's received in the initial delivery, leaving it with just 5 until the next batch comes along. It was a difficult incident for the country, though it came tinged with a minor success. Moonfish had managed to destroy 3 attack missiles and 1 attack drone before his plane crashed. When combined with the much greater success achieved when dealing with the Nightmare strike that came 2 days prior, it's clear Ukraine is starting to figure out how to use its F-16s to turn the tide of battle against Russia. All of which brings us to a key question. What have we learned so far? Speaking to the Ward Carroll YouTube channel, Professor Justin Bronk, a senior research fellow with the Royal United Services Institute, says that these early engagements show Ukraine is taking a cautious early approach with its F-16s. So far, we're not seeing a huge amount of what the Ukrainians are doing with the F-16, which in many ways is quite encouraging. It suggests they're being fairly cautious with them. It suggests that they're probably concentrating on working out and practicing the dispersed operation model, said Bronk. This early caution is smart on Ukraine's part, as it means it's tempering the elation of finally having F-16s with the reality that only had 6 of them as of the creation of this video. So it's deploying them in a limited defensive manner. There are no confirmed uses of the F-16 near the front lines, which Bronk points out is a far more dangerous use. They're also not being used to support the Kursk invasion, meaning Ukraine is either still working on the best strategy for a more offensive deployment, or it's biding its time until more of the promised 85 F-16s arrive in the country. Of course, these early engagements aren't risk-free, as we saw with Moonfish, but Ukraine choosing not to use its F-16s on the front lines right now means it believes the jets are best used in isolated engagements, which brings us to their current air defense role. Task and Purpose points out that the F-16 Ukraine lost wasn't flying near Kursk, and it wasn't lost near the borders where active fighting is taking place on the ground. This shows that the early assessments of their usage are correct, with Ukraine preferring to use its F-16s in an air defense role, meaning they will likely play the part of interceptors for the foreseeable future. Interestingly, the same channel also points out a side benefit of this interception strategy. Noting that there are only so many interceptor missiles to go around in Ukraine, Task and Purpose says that F-16s can more easily take out missiles and drones thanks to their advanced sensors, which frees up a lot of the older platforms to tackle riskier missions near the front lines. It sounds counterintuitive, but there's also a logic to this approach. Ukraine's pilots are far more experienced in flying Soviet-era jets that make up the majority of its air force. They know how to get the most out of them, says Task and Purpose, meaning Ukraine can use them to offer close air support to ground troops and conduct harassment missions, while the F-16 patrols the skies over Ukraine, ready to intercept any incoming missiles and drones. This approach also enables some level of training. After all, Ukraine's current F-16 pilots have only undergone around 6 months of training for a platform that usually requires 18 to master. By taking the more cautious approach of using F-16s as missile interceptors, Ukraine's pilots can cut their teeth on less dangerous targets, according to Task and Purpose. Perhaps the strategy is to gain greater familiarity with the platform in the short term, which will enable Ukraine's pilots to use F-16s in riskier frontline missions once the country has received more of its promised stock. That future looks brighter too, thanks to the F-16 opening up a whole new arsenal of weapons for Ukraine to use. Task and Purpose note that having Western jets at its disposal means that Ukraine now has access to the advanced weaponry developed by NATO that it previously was only able to jerry-rig into its Soviet-era jets. The channel points out that Ukraine's jets were forced to use R-60 infrared missiles and R-27 semi-active missiles during the early stages of the war, as those were all that were available, as well as being the only types of missiles the jets could use. Both missiles were developed in the 1980s, making them around 40 years out of date, and they resulted in Ukrainian pilots not having long-range capabilities. Compare that with Russian pilots who are using R-77 active radar missiles, and you see why this is so important. The R-77 has fire-and-forget capabilities, meaning the pilot can pull the trigger on the missile and then move away as the missile tracks its target. Ukraine's missiles required its pilots to keep the noses of their planes pointed at their targets, meaning they couldn't pull away to evade fire. That's all changed with the arrival of the F-16. The jet is capable of firing the AIM-120 AMRAAM missile, which offers both fire-and-forget and beyond visual range capabilities, with many calling it one of the best active radar missiles in the world. It has a range of over 20 miles and can move at supersonic speeds before delivering a blast fragmentation warhead to a target. With missiles like these, Ukraine doesn't just achieve parity with the weapon systems used in Russian jets, it exceeds them. As more F-16s arrive in Ukraine, it's likely that we will see more of the jets making their way to the front lines to more directly engage Russian jets in the skies. That could change the entire complexion of the war, as F-16s could tackle the planes Russia is using to launch glide bombs and take out targets on the ground to enable advances by Ukrainian soldiers. However, that type of strategy is likely being reserved for the future, when Ukraine is more capable of unleashing the full potential of its F-16s. For now, it's going down a more defensive route, which brings us back to Ukraine's current usage of the F-16 as an interceptor. It's been making the jet even more capable of carrying out its role by implementing new defensive systems. Task and Purpose examined the F-16s that were on display during Zelensky's August 4th announcement of their arrival and noticed that they had new pieces of kit installed beyond their missile systems. An examination of the jet's pylons revealed that some of them look bulkier than they should, with one even looking like it had small vents and a camera lens installed. That's the combination of pylon-integrated dispensing systems and electronic combat-integrated pylon systems, Task and Purpose said, adding that they are additional defensive models created to improve the F-16's survivability. With these systems, Ukraine's F-16s can use jammers capable of spoofing the radar signals enemy missiles produce, preventing them from locking onto their fighter jet while it's in the air. The systems are even powerful enough to confuse ground-based anti-air systems, as well as larger aircraft. Add an AAR-60 missile warning system to those pylons, which uses ultraviolet light to detect the exhaust plume an incoming missile produces, and you have extensive defensive capabilities. Those capabilities will prove essential as Ukraine continues to use F-16s in an interception capacity. They'll also prove vital should Ukraine ever send its F-16s into direct combat with Russian fighters on the front lines. By now we're getting a clearer picture of the Ukrainian strategy. It's using F-16s to intercept missiles and drones for now, all while preparing its pilots for a future in which it has more of those aerial platforms available, which may allow it to run more advanced operations closer to the front. Even if that future doesn't come to pass, the use of F-16s may free up Ukraine's Soviet-era aircraft to operate on the front lines in safe knowledge that the F-16s are protecting key Ukrainian military installations. And there's more. Returning to Justin Bronk's conversation with Wade Carroll, Bronk says that Ukraine has been attacking Russian air bases with large missile salvos already. By bringing F-16s into those strikes, Ukraine develops a greater chance for success, which will put more pressure on Russia to evacuate its air bases, relieving pressure on Ukraine in the process. Ukraine can potentially try and blend missile and HIMARS attacks to create this pressure, Bronk claims, which will result in Russia pulling more of its jets further back. Not only does this lower the risk of Russia sending glide bombs and its own jets into Ukraine, but it also creates space for Ukraine's F-16s to operate on the front lines with less risk of encountering Russian fighters. Even if Russia goes down the opposite path and creates layered defenses at its air bases near the front lines, Bronk claims, that will mean offering less defensive capacity to troops and installations that are actually on those front lines. Again, that would create opportunities for Ukraine's F-16s, allowing them to operate at lower risk as they'll face fewer defenses. This creates a win-win situation for Ukraine. Risk is lowered either because Russia is pulling back, which also helps Ukraine's ground troops, or it's lowered because Russia's front-line defenses are sent to its air bases, giving the F-16s more room to operate. Again, this is likely a strategy for the future. Ukraine will need to receive more than the number of F-16s promised to it to make this pressure tell. All of that brings us to the ultimate goal Ukraine wants to achieve with its F-16s, preventing Russia from gaining or retaining air superiority. As faltering as Russia's efforts to gain this superiority have been, given that it's lost 368 planes and 328 helicopters already, it's at least been able to rely on its aerial might from behind the front lines. Glide bombs are launched from bases Ukraine can't reach, for instance, allowing Russia to rain explosives down on Ukrainian targets with little recourse. Brock says the foreseeable future of Ukraine's F-16 strategy is not to gain air superiority, it's to prevent Russia from gaining air superiority. With Brock noting that even with its full fleet of F-16s, Ukraine will still be facing a Russia that has a fleet somewhere in the region of 350 genuinely modern and capable fast jets that are individually at a technical level significantly more capable than the F-16 in most metrics. So Ukraine's goal is to be capable of defending its skies rather than using its F-16s to operate with impunity over the front lines. That's an achievable goal that, if Ukraine realizes it, will relieve the pressure placed on its key military installations and troops on the ground. With his aerial options restricted, Putin will be forced to either waste more of his missiles and drones on strikes, cutting into his already dwindling supplies, or simply send more soldiers into a war that's already cost Russia over 630,000 military personnel. In the end, it's about imposing cost, argues Bronk. That's seen in the Kursk invasion and the long-range missile and drone strikes Ukraine has used against Russian energy facilities and its Black Sea fleet. Ukraine's new F-16s are likely going to become an extension of that strategy. They'll cost Russia valuable missiles, while helping Ukraine simply not lose the war long enough for its other strategies to really add up, to the point where Putin may have to pull out based on cost alone. Still, there's one thing that's being underestimated when it comes to Ukraine's use of the F-16. The impending arrival of the Saab 340 aircraft. In May 2024, Sweden announced that it would donate 2 of its Saab 340s to Ukraine, in a move that flew somewhat under the radar. With all the hubbub about Ukraine receiving F-16s, Task and Purpose suggests that the arrival of these planes could be a real force multiplier in terms of how Ukraine is able to leverage its F-16s. Why? Because it's a radar aircraft that's capable of spotting incoming threats before the F-16 systems can locate them. An F-16 without being backed up by this type of radar aircraft is like shooting a rifle without an ACOG or Advanced Combat Optical Gunsight scope, says the channel. The Saab 340 will serve as that scope. Though it's essentially a twin turboprop plane, the Saab 340 comes with a high-tech radar system and the ability to communicate the data it retrieves directly to an F-16 in the field. So the Saab 340 will track incoming missiles and similar threats at extremely far distances, allowing it to send tracking data to the F-16s so they can eliminate the threat. The arrival of the Saab 340 will reinforce Ukraine's use of the F-16 as an interceptor, making it far more effective than it currently is. And that, more than anything else, can make Ukraine's F-16 capable of turning the tide of the Ukraine war. With Saab 340s at their sides, Ukraine's F-16s become cruise and ballistic missile destroying machines, creating enormous costs for the Russian military while making their future missile strikes less effective. Perhaps that's why the Russian company Forez, likely under advice from Putin, is offering a 15 million ruble reward to the first soldier who manages to shoot down an F-16. That bounty, which amounts to about $170,000, is a sure sign that Putin needs Ukraine's F-16s out of the sky so he can continue his special military operation in the way he envisions it. Of course, there are still challenges ahead for Ukraine. The 6 F-16s it's received so far, or rather 5 now that one crashed, are far from enough to allow Ukraine to establish air superiority. They also aren't enough for Ukraine to fully realize its defensive strategy, meaning Ukraine can't start sending its Soviet-era fighters to the front lines yet. There's also the training issue to confront. 6 months of training has made Ukraine's pilots capable, but they're not at the stage where they can get the most out of the F-16 systems yet. Flying defensive missions, which are relatively low risk compared to frontline sorties, can boost flight hours, but there's still a clear skill gap that needs to be filled. It's also worth pointing out that Ukraine doesn't have access to the most modern weapons the F-16 can use. The US and NATO may not want to risk the most advanced weapons providing an intelligence coup for potential adversaries, claims Task and Purpose, while pointing out that Russia may be able to reverse engineer anything that it captures from crashed F-16s. There's still plenty of good news for Ukraine to take away from its first use of the F-16. It knows the jets are capable of shooting cruise missiles out of the sky, and that its pilots are well trained enough to make use of the planes. More flight hours will only build on this training, opening up further options in the future upon the arrival of the Saab 340s and the rest of the promised F-16 stock. And if Ukraine can maintain as many of its F-16s as possible, it's going to be able to use them to chip away at Russia's aerial and missile forces, as well as potentially offer support to its ground troops to drag Russia even deeper into a war of attrition that's already cost Putin and his military heavily. The F-16s aren't going to turn the tide of the war alone, but Ukraine's clever usage of them so far suggests that they'll become a vital piece of the Ukraine war puzzle, that when combined with Ukraine's other cost-creating strategies, will put and keep Putin on his back foot until he's forced to negotiate. What do you think about the arrival of the F-16s in Ukraine? Has Ukraine used them effectively so far, and do you think it will change up or build on its current strategies once more of these multi-role fighters arrive?
Russia is a country at war. Hearing this sentence, your natural instinct will probably be to think of the Russo-Ukrainian War, which has escalated into the largest European conflict since World War II. But what if we told you that another war rages quietly within Russia's own borders, almost as long as the conflict with Ukraine itself? That's right, Russia isn't just fighting Ukraine, it's also fighting itself. In one corner, the entrenched elite, struggling to maintain their grip on a fractured empire. In another, a rising wave of discontent and resistance, challenging the very foundations of that empire. While this war isn't one of headlines and grand military maneuvers, it's just as consequential for the future of the Russian nation, if not more. This is the story of Russia's silent civil war. When it comes to inter-country wars, the situation is pretty clear-cut. There's usually a well-defined cause, straightforward objective, generally understood rules of engagement, and easily identifiable enemies. The battles are fought with weapons, and the outcomes are measured by territorial gains and losses, as well as direct battle deaths. In a civil war, on the other hand, all rules and boundaries are blurred. That's what makes each civil war a unique phenomenon. Still, some common elements often emerge, even amidst the chaos. In most civil wars, there's some kind of prior conflict, a simmering issue that's gradually escalated. This can be a historical grievance, as was the case with the American Civil War, long-standing political corruption like the one fueling the Syrian War, or deep social and economic inequalities that have been suppressed but never fully addressed, which led to some major bloodshed in conflicts like the Rwandan Civil War. Russia's silent civil war is unique in this regard, as the prior conflict in question is an external one, the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Russia's military engagement with Ukraine has had profound internal repercussions, creating growing divisions within the country itself. But why? Isn't the invasion of Ukraine just a special military operation aiming to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, as Russia's President Vladimir Putin put it? Of course not. As soon as Kyiv didn't immediately fall when faced with 190,000 Russian troops and tens of thousands of its vehicles, the so-called special operation became a very real war. A war that fought to strip a democratic country of its very statehood and its people of their identity. But as much as Putin tried to spout a narrative about the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, calling them one people, the harsh reality was far different. So the Russian people soon started to catch on. It's not about liberation, it's about domination. And so Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 pushed forward a long-standing decline, one that has been underway for 20 years, in democratic freedoms, media autonomy, and civil society at home. In the words of Konstantin Egert, an exiled Russian journalist, the war in Ukraine finally allowed Putin and his crowd to introduce a uniform ideology in Russia, which they always dreamt of introducing, but they couldn't do it because they were supposed to play democracy. Sure, this supposed democracy has always been somewhat of a facade, but as the Russian author Grigory Kartashvili, who goes by the pen name Boris Akunin, puts it, Russia was a troubled, chaotic democracy, an interesting country where a lot of things were happening. Now it's become totally Kafkaesque, Orwellian. And in such an autocratic regime, a civil war is almost inevitable, especially considering how poorly the Russian government treats its people. On the one hand, there are soldiers fighting in Ukraine whose role in this war can be best summed up in two words: cannon fodder. Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as many as 592,000 Russian troops have either been killed or injured, according to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces. That's 10 times more than the total number of casualties of the Soviet Union's decade-long invasion of Afghanistan. Add the thousands of people missing or left behind in Ukraine, and it becomes clear that the human cost of Putin's brutal war is staggering. But how is this possible? Sure, the Ukrainians have been fighting fearlessly, beyond what many could have imagined. They're also supported by Western allies, with the US alone donating over $40 billion in military aid until February 29, 2024. However, the main reason Russia is suffering such heavy losses is Russia itself. Since the invasion started, the Kremlin made one reckless decision after another. First, it was the so-called partial mobilization of the Russian reservists in the fall of 2022, when 300,000 people were forced to join the army, clearly showing how bad the invasion was going only 7 months in. Vice News, a long-form news content unit with the Canadian-American media outlet Vice, visited a Russian theater-turned-draft center, processing some 100 recruits a day to gauge the reaction of those being conscripted. The conscription itself was never the problem. After all, in times of war, mobilizing additional troops is a common practice. The real issue lay in the execution and the underlying conditions that accompanied this mobilization. To start, the soldiers were only given 24 hours to report for duty, a stark contrast to the usual 3 days they previously received to say goodbye to their loved ones. In this scenario, conscripts living in a different city didn't even have a chance to kiss their parents goodbye. And even if their families managed to reach the draft center in time to say goodbye, they were only given 3 minutes to do so. 3 minutes to convey the gravity of their departure, share heartfelt words, and offer an embrace, all while fearing that it might be the last one ever. Still, many conscripts only spoke highly of their duty, either out of true blind faith or fear to speak critically of the war, which has since become a criminal offense. Alexei, a young conscript soldier interviewed by Vice, shared that he felt proud of his country and the fact he didn't shun his duty. He added he was ready to defend his motherland, not doubting for a second that it would emerge victorious. When asked whether he was willing to give his life for his motherland, his answer was affirmative, emphasizing that pride and courage are the most important things. If the Kremlin appropriately rewarded Alexei and others like him, these strong patriotic sentiments might have been sustained or even amplified. But what the Kremlin did instead was send the fresh recruits into battle with poor training, poor equipment, and worst of all, poor leadership. So video after video started emerging from the Ukrainian battlefield. New soldiers carrying rusty rifles, fresh recruits bringing their own makeshift medical kits, units sent to the front line within days of entering Ukraine despite having no formal training, commanders being drunk while their men died. Even getting badly injured in the war didn't guarantee better treatment. Most of the injured soldiers didn't receive proper therapy, and some of them were sent back to the front lines to fight. They were adding insult to literal injury. Given the horrifying reports coming from Ukraine, it shouldn't be surprising that many veterans deemed this war significantly worse than Chechnya, Georgia, or any other conflict modern Russia took part in. It also shouldn't be surprising that the war in Ukraine dealt a massive blow to the patriotism of even the most ardent supporters of the Kremlin. After all, when their country needed help, they stepped up. Yet they were only rewarded with an unrelenting cycle of disappointment and suffering. The more the abysmal treatment of the Russian soldiers became public, the worse the reactions to it got. At first, thousands of Russians fled the country to escape suffering the same fate, but then protests erupted. Military recruitment centers were set on fire. A conscription officer was even shot in Siberia. One would think that these alarming reactions would be a wake-up call for the Kremlin, but that person would be oh so terribly wrong. The Kremlin only doubled down on its repressive measures, awarding undeserving generals with medals while feeding the soldiers to the meat grinder. The government also intensified its crackdown on dissent, implemented stricter laws, and tightened control over information. In a grim display of authoritarianism, the regime pursued harsh penalties for those caught protesting in any way, squashing any trace of freedom of expression. The deepening repression underscored a regime more concerned with maintaining its grip on power than addressing the genuine grievances and dire conditions facing its people. Some 30 years ago, cases of treason were quite rare in Russia. Now anyone could be declared a traitor, be it a foreigner or a Russian citizen. In 2023 alone, there were over 100 known treason cases in Russia, reminding us of many of the infamous show trials and purges of the Stalinist era. The trials of the Putin era all shared similar characteristics. They were held behind closed doors. The specific charges and evidence supposedly secured by Russia's Federal Security Service or FSB were always shrouded in secrecy. The trials always resulted in convictions and lengthy prison terms. Many of the traitors, spies, and saboteurs, as Putin labeled the barrage of alleged enemies of the state, simply found themselves on the wrong side of an increasingly paranoid regime. And so Ivan Safronov, an advisor to the Roscosmos space agency and former military affairs journalist, was sentenced to 22 years in prison in 2022 for treason. Safronov denied these charges, insisting they were nothing but retaliation for his reporting on the military. Interestingly, his father, Ivan Ivanovich Safronov, also a journalist, died after falling from the 5th floor of his Moscow apartment building in 2007. Although his death was ruled a suicide, there were widespread suspicions that Ivan Ivanovich's death was not accidental. Many believed he was targeted for his investigative work, which often exposed sensitive military issues. The parallels between the father's mysterious death and the son's harsh sentencing were hard to ignore, leading to speculation that the Safronov family had long been under scrutiny by the state. Other notable figures who suffered a similar fate as the Safronov family include physicist Dmitry Kolka, arrested in a hospital where he was treated for advanced pancreatic cancer for supposedly revealing state secrets in his lectures in China. After being taken to Lefortovo prison, his family was told he had died in a hospital there, raising questions about the harsh treatment of terminally ill prisoners. Physicist Valery Golobkin, accused of similar charges and sentenced to 12 years, reflecting a pattern of targeting academics and scientists under the pretext of protecting state secrets. Physicist Anatoly Maslov, sentenced to 14 years for treason, adding to the growing fear among the scientific community in Russia as more researchers became ensnared in what many viewed as politically motivated prosecutions. Politician Vladimir Kara-Murza, sentenced to 25 years in prison for giving speeches critical of Russia in the West. Luckily, Kara-Murza was released on August 1, 2024, as part of the most extensive prisoner exchange between the US and Russia since the end of the Cold War. The Wall Street Journal's Evan Gershkovich, sentenced to 16 years in prison on espionage charges. He was also one of 26 political prisoners released in the August 1st exchange. As a result of these horrifying persecutions, powerful voices standing up against Putin and his ruling elite are becoming a rarity. And who can blame them when speaking up can only get you in one of these three places: in prison, in exile, or 6 feet under. However, prominent Russian and foreign figures aren't the only ones Russia is waging a silent civil war against. The most horrific stories are coming from all corners of the country, where ordinary citizens are finding themselves ensnared in the Kremlin's web of repression. Sometimes for something as simple as holding a sign calling for peace, repeating a chant, and even reciting a poem. That's right, Artem Kamardin, a 33-year-old Russian amateur poet, was jailed and given a 7-year sentence for reciting a poem. But this was not before he was brutally beaten by Russian police, stripped naked, and ordered to ask for forgiveness on video, and even sexually assaulted with a metal bar. His fiancée, who was present for the brutal raid and later interviewed by Vice, was also threatened with sexual violence, with the Russian forces trying to glue her lips together to silence her screams. Similar horror stories have emerged from across the country, painting a chilling picture of the Russian state's systematic crackdown on dissent. These accounts reveal a regime that has abandoned any pretense of justice or humanity, instead resorting to sheer brutality to maintain control. According to an independent media and human rights defense group focused on Russia, OVD Info, over 260 people are currently serving jail terms for crimes related to taking an anti-war stance. This number is just a small fraction of the staggering 20,040 people who've been detained for the same reason since February 24, 2022. There have also been 622 cases of extrajudicial pressure for an anti-war stance, as well as 1,206 cases of pressure on media workers and journalists. Another figure of note is the 45 repressive laws introduced since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. Most of these laws, 26 of them, deal with the so-called foreign cooperation and foreign agents. 10 of them target freedom of speech and expression, and 5 aim to regulate the internet. In some cases, sentences for the crimes committed under these laws are equal to those passed down for murder. As for the potential defendants under these laws, the list grows longer by the day, and virtually anyone can make the list. As OVD Info lawyer and analyst Daria Korolenko puts it, they will imprison old people, they will imprison people who have disabilities, they will imprison people with children and women with children. They just want everyone to be silent. So Evgenia Mayboroda, a 72-year-old woman from Russia's Rostov region, was jailed for 5.5 years in early 2023 for spreading false information about the Russian army on social media. The false information in question, an emotional video about the number of Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine. All things considered, it shouldn't be surprising that one of the prominent individuals jailed for his words, Oleg Orlov, described Russia as sinking deeper and deeper into this darkness at an ever-quickening pace. And in this darkness, there's no room for accurate media reporting or democratic institutions, so the Kremlin has been on a mission to dismantle both, sending more clear messages that a Russian civil war is underway. As far as media goes, a severely damaged information space is nothing new for Russia. Every special operation, conducted by the state, Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea, has been accompanied by a purge of the media space. However, this de facto military censorship has reached new heights after the invasion of Ukraine. The goal is clear: to irreversibly break the flow of independent information and ensure that only the Kremlin's narrative prevails. As a result, a new, alternate reality has been created by the Kremlin, one where the Kremlin is supported by the majority of people, where Russia is the liberator and Ukraine is the oppressor. The Ukrainian people are vile, fascist Nazis, committing genocide against the Russian people. Even Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president and a Jewish person, is a Nazi. These messages are plastered all over, on state-run TV channels, news bulletins, and nationwide billboards. As Korolenko puts it, the climate is fed by the mainstream media that everyone is a spy and a traitor, foreign agent. Everyone wants to destroy Russia, destroy your home. Besides utilizing the Russian people against the common enemy, these campaigns are also trying to persuade them to join the army voluntarily, often playing on male fragility. Do you want to be a hero, a true patriot, or a spineless coward? But you see, these tried-and-true methods of manipulation and propaganda aren't as effective today as they were in the Soviet era. Why? 2 words: the internet. Russia's youth, more connected than ever through social media and alternative news sources, are increasingly exposed to diverse perspectives and information. Unlike the Soviet era, when state-controlled media was the sole source of news, today's digital age allows for rapid dissemination of uncensored information and alternative viewpoints. So what does the Kremlin do? It focuses on the internet specifically, of course. The Kremlin is heavily investing in the Institute for Internet Development, or IID, whose goal is to essentially funnel nationalistic online content. In 2022, this organization received $163 million from the Russian state. In 2023, this figure rose to $217 million, while in 2024, it's expected to reach $282 million. All the online shows produced by the IRI are designed to reinforce the Kremlin's narrative and suppress dissenting views. These productions are aimed at saturating the digital landscape with state-approved content, trying to counteract the influence of independent and foreign media, which are desperately trying to show the Russian people the true cost of the war. Besides the internet, the only way people can find out what's truly happening in this information vacuum is through a series of somewhat unreliable Russian Telegram accounts. But many people don't need any official or unofficial sources of information to understand what's truly happening in their country. All they need to see is the increasing number of graves across the country, with families not even allowed to open coffins of their loved ones before burying them. Signs of unjust suffering are visible across Russia, so it's only a matter of time before the current silent civil war turns into a fully fledged uprising. This possibility is only further supported by the pace at which Russian people are losing trust in the legitimacy of government institutions and the rule of law in Russia. The 2024 Russian presidential elections are the perfect example of this. After 3 days of voting, Putin reportedly won over 88% of the vote, getting re-elected as president for an unprecedented fifth time. In another drastic step away from democracy, Putin made amendments to the Russian constitution in 2020 to allow him to remain in power, potentially until 2036, when he would be 84 years old. Although Putin's victory was a foregone conclusion before the first ballot was even cast, the sheer scale of electoral fraud and manipulation was still astounding. Ballot stuffing, voter intimidation, busing Putin supporters to vote multiple times at different locations, forcing people to vote at gunpoint. There was nothing subtle about the efforts to skew the results in Putin's favor. Of course, there were still protests against the inevitable outcome. Thousands of Russians agreed to vote at noon on Sunday, thus symbolically supporting the late pro-democracy activist Alexei Navalny, who endorsed the Noon Against Putin plan on social media before he died. Others showed their discontent by spoiling their ballots and writing Navalny's name on them. Speaking of Navalny, many believed his death to be the conclusive phase of the country's regression toward authoritarian rule. Once Navalny, Putin's most prominent critic, was killed in February 2024, there was no going back. As Akunin explains it, by killing Alexei Navalny, they lost the last chance of trying to pretend that they were decent, law-abiding. Violence has now become the central pillar of the Russian state, and no matter how the war in Ukraine ends, the trajectory of the Kremlin's authoritarian regime seems unalterable. As long as the Kremlin is fighting its own people, violence won't dissipate from Russia. With this in mind, a question instantly arises. Will this silent civil war grow into an all-out uprising? Quite possibly. Although the country's regime's brutal tactics are aimed at preventing this, they might just push the ordinary Russian people over the edge, thus having the opposite effect. After all, Russia was already on the brink of a fully fledged civil war in June of 2023. This is when the infamous Wagner Group rebellion took place, checking all the boxes for an impending civil war. A fragmentation of security forces, loyalty shifts, the rise of armed groups' activity, escalating civil unrest. Prior to the rebellion, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, a private military company whose fighters have taken part in brutal conflicts all over Africa and the Middle East, openly and publicly criticized the Russian leadership for their poor handling of the invasion and inadequate support for the troops. He reported news straight from the front lines, earning international recognition. While Prigozhin's true motives can be debated, one thing was for certain: he showed the true state of the Russian military and its leadership. He labeled the Russian parliament members as useless, saying they should be the ones to go to the front first. Prigozhin didn't mince his words when talking about the commanders of the Russian army too, proclaiming they should be sent to the front barefoot with just a submachine gun. He particularly taunted Russia's former Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, calling him lazy and blaming him for the unnecessary full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. According to Prigozhin, the invasion of Ukraine was launched because Shoigu and his oligarch friends became greedy for more Ukrainian territories, causing them to push the Russian military into a pointless war that took hundreds of thousands of their lives. Prigozhin's message was clear: the evil brought by the military leadership of the country must be stopped. So he set out to do just that. Insults and call-outs turned into a full-blown rebellion in June 2023, when Prigozhin and 25,000 of his Wagner Group forces launched an unprecedented armed insurrection against the Kremlin. They started by seizing Rostov-on-Don, a Russian city a couple of miles from the Ukrainian border. Prigozhin posted a video of himself in the courtyard of the Southern Military District headquarters in the city, dispelling any doubts about his intentions. Interestingly, even on the eve of this insurrection, Putin reportedly didn't believe that it would ever actually happen, showing just how disconnected he'd become from the internal dissent brewing within his ranks. His disbelief underscored a dangerous complacency, allowing the rebellion to gain momentum and catch the Kremlin off guard. The Wagner Group rebellion was characterized by a rapid and audacious march toward Moscow, Russia's capital, seizing some military and administrative installations along the way. The armored columns bound for Moscow consisted of 5,000 to 8,000 combatants with tanks, armored vehicles, anti-aircraft weaponry, and civilian trucks. According to reports, the closest the Wagner Group got to Moscow was some 59 miles south of the city, reaching the town of Kashira. However, the only visual confirmation places Prigozhin's troops in Krasnoye in northern Lipetsk Oblast, 210 miles south of Moscow. Regardless of how far the Wagner Group got, it was clear that the sudden rebellion severely rattled the Kremlin and exposed significant vulnerabilities within the Russian state. The Wagner Group's advance, even if it didn't quite reach Moscow, demonstrated the capacity for serious internal dissent and the potential for rapid and destabilizing action in war-torn Russia. After almost 2 full days of advances, Prigozhin accepted a deal with Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko to prevent bloodshed. The deal was for the Wagner Group to cease any advancement and return to the base in exchange for a guarantee of its safety. If you're wondering why Lukashenko was the one to broker the deal, it's because Putin refused to speak to Prigozhin, who he once saw as a powerful ally. Putin previously denounced Prigozhin, though not by name, stating, "Exorbitant ambitions and personal interests have led to treason." And by now you know how Putin responds to treason at the highest level. Exactly 2 months after the Wagner Group rebellion, Prigozhin's airplane en route from Moscow to St. Petersburg crashed, killing all 10 people inside, including Prigozhin and several senior Wagner members. Though there were some claims that the aircraft was shot down by Russian air defenses over Tver Oblast, Western intelligence believed that an explosion on board was the culprit. Either way, the man who so publicly defied Putin and challenged the Kremlin's authority was no more. In the year since, the Kremlin has effectively dismantled the Wagner Group, placing the ex-Wagner troops across the Russian state. The goal was to eliminate a single person in charge, thus neutralizing any potential resurgence of organized resistance. Although some observers believed the Wagner Group would be eliminated, this was never going to happen. For one, Russia can't afford to lose any more soldiers, especially those as well trained and experienced as the Wagner troops. According to the US National Security Council, as many as 50,000 Wagner mercenaries were fighting in Ukraine at one point, underscoring just how crucial they are for the war effort. But also, the Wagner Group has historically been incredibly important for the Russian state, both geopolitically and economically, making it an invaluable asset beyond the war in Ukraine. With the dismantling of the Wagner Group, it's safe to say that no potential Putin adversary is strong enough to consolidate power and challenge his grip on the Kremlin, for now at least. Given how fast Russia is fracturing into power blocks and how seemingly willing the Kremlin is to target its own people, the situation in Russia remains volatile, and that's the understatement of the century. But what do you think? Is Russia inevitably heading for a full-scale civil war once its citizens finally reach a breaking point and rise against the regime's oppressive tactics? Or will the Kremlin's heavy-handed control and strategic dispersal of dissenters prevent such a scenario from unfolding?
The Ukrainian war is one of the most closely watched conflicts in modern history. But the raw numbers reveal a story that's far more chilling than you might think. What hidden patterns are emerging from the chaos? Could these numbers predict the future of this brutal war? Our military experts have been digging deep, and what they've uncovered is both shocking and sobering. Russia's illegal war in Ukraine has brought devastation on an unimaginable scale. The violence is staggering, but the numbers tells a story that the words alone cannot. 1,200 kilometers of front line, 150,000 homes reduced to rubble, entire cities obliterated. And the cost? The World Bank estimates it will take over $500 billion to rebuild what's been lost. As both sides dig in, this war has become a grueling battle of attrition with no end in sight. Each day grinds forward with no easy answers, only more destruction. In today's video, we're diving into the hard data that reveals the true scope of this conflict, from the shifting battle lines to the staggering humanitarian crisis. These statistics aren't just numbers, they're the key to understanding the war's ongoing impact and what might come next. Whether you're here to learn about military strategy or to grasp the human toll, this analysis will give you the insights you need. Let's dive in. 2.5 years ago, Russian forces shocked the world by launching Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. One of their primary objectives was the swift capture of Kyiv, Ukraine's capital, in an attempt to destabilize and overthrow the Ukrainian government. Crossing through Belarus, the vanguard of a combined force of 360,000 Russian soldiers converged on Kyiv from the west and northeast. Despite initial gains in the encirclement of key suburbs, Ukrainian forces stood firm, employing guerrilla tactics, fortified defenses, and effective use of anti-tank weapons to stymie their overconfident foe. The Russian advance soon stalled. Logistical challenges, the underestimation of Ukrainian resolve, and the effective Ukrainian counterattacks forced Russian troops into retreat by early April 2022, marking a significant failure in Russia's strategy to decapitate the Zelensky regime in the war's opening phase. The war has since devolved into a prolonged, grinding struggle. As Russia refocused its military efforts on the eastern Donbass region and southern coast, the conflict has become characterized by intense, sustained artillery duels, trench warfare, and incremental territorial gains by both sides. Progress is measured in meters rather than miles. The Russian military, unable to achieve its initial objectives, resorted to relentless bombardments and exhaustion tactics, aiming to wear down Ukrainian forces and civilian infrastructure. Meanwhile, Ukraine, bolstered by Western military aid and intelligence support, adopted a strategy of strategic defense and localized counteroffensives, gradually reclaiming occupied territories, albeit at significant cost. Ukraine knew it would struggle from the start. Its campaign would unfold on a scale the world had not seen since the Second World War. The Ukrainian armed forces faced an enemy with a population 4 times as large as their own, an alleged superpower with 5 times as many armored fighting vehicles, more than 160,000 to Ukraine's 22,110. 3 times as many artillery pieces, 4,397 to 1,639. 5 times as many air defense systems, 1,760 to 81 for Ukraine. Well over 10 times as many aircraft and a navy, comparatively at least, that stood second to none in its own backyard. Ukraine worked hard since the initial 2014 Russian seizure of Crimea to modernize its military. They chose to mold it in the image of the West, with a trained reserve and Western-supplied combat units that consciously and incrementally jettisoned traditional Soviet doctrines. Since 2021, Ukraine has converted its military ranks to NATO standards. Ukrainian soldiers use Sir, with the addition of a military rank, rather than the more traditional comrade. It trains its forces to operate in self-contained brigades, each capable of solving problems in its area of responsibility. Starting the war with around 250,000 active-duty military personnel and 220,000 reservists, it's seen significant injections of Western air defense systems, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, anti-tank weapons, small arms, and many other implements since 2022. The total amount of Western aid, both pledged and donated, is today fast approaching $400 billion. More on that later. How have both sides been attrited over almost 2.5 years of conflict? Estimates vary. By the end of 2023, Russia had lost the equivalent of 90% of its original invasion force. What that means is that out of an original force of 360,000, 315,000 have been killed or injured, with upwards of 70,000 killed, at least 45,000 of them killed in 2023 alone. Some suggest the number of fatalities could be at least twice as high. US intelligence officials, for example, claim that as many as 120,000 Russian troops have been killed, with 170 to 180,000 wounded, compared to nearly 70,000 Ukrainian troops killed and 100 to 120,000 wounded. Others place Russian manpower losses alone at upwards of 500,000. A recent report by the Atlantic Council put it best. To put these numbers in context, Russia's losses in the recent 4-month campaign for Avdiivka were greater than the Soviet Union suffered in its decade-long war in Afghanistan. There were more than 2,000 new Russian fatalities reported in just the last 2 weeks of July 2024 alone, and more than likely, the actual numbers are much, much higher. On August 5, 2024, Russia lost 1,180 soldiers in a single day, a decrease from a maximum of 1,262 in May, when Russian forces were conducting counter-offensive operations along the Kharkiv axis. These losses are frankly staggering, even if the statistics themselves remain fickle at best. Casualty estimates during ongoing combat operations are notoriously difficult to calculate, with both sides aggressively censoring their data. Still, if a recent report is to be believed, in Russia the number of obituaries is rising so fast that they can't keep up with them. In all, according to one insider, the increase in losses of Russian troops in recent months has been much more significant than expected. On the Russian side alone, more than 3,600 officers have been killed, a number that includes 424 with the rank of lieutenant colonel or higher. It's perhaps telling of the type of military Russia has built that analysts of the conflict claim it's expended 11,463 prison inmates killed on Ukraine's eastern front. The losses of military hardware and equipment have been somewhat easier to track, thanks to the revolutionary rise in the use of open-source intelligence, OSINT, a mode of analysis that utilizes a wide range of publicly available data, satellite images, social media posts, videos, and other digital footprints to offer a more immediate and nuanced view of the conflict. Oryx Pionkop, a Dutch open-source intelligence defense analysis website and research group, often referred to simply as Oryx, has been one of the best examples of meticulous OSINT use during the current war. Since 2022, Oryx has gained prominence for its comprehensive and independently verified list of destroyed, captured, and abandoned military equipment from both sides in the conflict. To date, Russia has lost 17,300 individual vehicles and other major pieces of military equipment. The breakdown is pretty sobering when cast against other conflicts of similar scale. 3,309 of these documented losses are Russian tanks, of which 2,264 have been destroyed outright, with another 522 captured, 367 abandoned, and 156 damaged. Russia has also lost 1,518 armored vehicles, including various models of BMPs, BTRs, and MT-LBVMs, along with 4,400 infantry fighting vehicles. Destroyed, captured, and abandoned armored personnel carriers amount to 477. There have been 271 lost infantry mobility vehicles, 284 command posts and communication stations, 535 engineering and logistics vehicles, to say nothing of 402 multiple rocket launchers, 394 towed and 802 self-propelled artillery pieces destroyed or lost. Russian air defenses have taken a significant hit as well, with 268 surface-to-air missile systems and dozens of expensive radar, jammers, and deception systems taken off the battlefield by Ukrainian forces. Ukraine, having taken significant losses to their own air force in the early stages of the war, has been able to deny Russia air superiority by knocking 122 aircraft and 140 helicopters off Russian rolls. This has been an amazing achievement considering that by March 2023, Ukraine's entire fighter fleet had been whittled down to a mere 69 aircraft, barely more than 3 fighter squadrons by NATO standards. Russian losses at sea have been even more eye-opening, considering the fact that Ukraine has been operating on a naval shoestring since the country's opening days, that is to say, basically lacking any navy to speak of. The fact that Russia has lost 26 naval ships and submarines to date, most of them to homegrown naval drones, uncrewed aerial vehicles, and US-provided long-range Army tactical missile systems, or ATACMS, belies the fact that this number proved significant enough to cripple Russia's once vaunted Black Sea Fleet. As of the summer of 2024, Ukrainian missile attacks have forced Russia to withdraw its entire fleet from its bases in Sevastopol. The math of the war at sea is revealing. Generally, but depending on the contract, each ATACMS missile has a hefty price tag of around $1.3 million and possesses a range in the ballpark of 190 miles. British-made Storm Shadow missiles have an even longer range and are twice as expensive. Previously, Ukraine claimed to have extensively damaged one of Russia's Kilo-class submarines in the Black Sea using a Storm Shadow missile. More recently, it claimed to sink a Kilo-class submarine using an ATACMS missile. The Rostov-on-Don submarine, for example, a $300 million investment, was thus taken out by a weapon 1/300th of the price. Ukraine is also using these weapons to destroy oil depots, port facilities, amphibious landing ships at dockside, and other investments, losses which have effectively rendered Russia's naval prospects functionally inactive for the foreseeable future. The financial asymmetry of Ukrainian naval warfare can be seen in the nature of drone warfare writ large as it's evolved throughout the conflict. As the war progressed, smart, low-cost drone technology has enabled Ukraine to counteract some of its most pressing disadvantages, that of manpower and its damaged military-industrial base, for example. "This is a war of drones," noted one Ukrainian political advisor. "They are a superweapon here." Notably, while the dollar-per-kill ratio is several orders of magnitude lower than other weapons, they also have a very high kill-per-mission ratio, as they target individual targets such as single soldiers or tanks, much more than the random death dealt by missiles and bombs targeting things like supermarkets or frontline physical defenses. Having been used to attack everything from Russian soldiers cowering in burnt-out hulls of destroyed tanks, the Kremlin, and everything in between, drones, both homemade and commercially produced, offer a viable alternative to far more expensive and technologically sophisticated military systems like fighter jets, tanks, and artillery. For the price of a single F-35 fighter jet, you can buy 55,000 Chinese-made DJI Mavic 3 drones, the chosen model currently employed by both Russian and Ukrainian forces. At $2,000 apiece, it doesn't matter whether they break or not. They're easy to maintain and even easier to jerry-rig with all manner of ordnance. Even if a fifth of these drones make it through to their target, you're looking at 10,000 confirmed kills, all for the price of a single F-35. Today, drones have become an essential strategic and offensive element of the war. Both sides employ assault drone companies, down to the brigade level. Drones in Ukraine vary in size from 12 centimeters to drones with wingspans over 15 meters. Quadcopters and other rotor drones are the most common, with larger armed systems like the Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2 causing significant damage in the early phases of the conflict, before Russian electronic warfare systems developed robust enough defenses to shoot them down. Ukraine claims it's losing 10,000 drones a month, yet by early 2024, there were as many as 200 independent companies producing cheap drones throughout the country to account for these losses. Domestic output is up 100 times higher than the first year of the war, with Ukrainian officials setting a target of 1 million drones to be produced in calendar year 2024, approximately double the amount of artillery shells furnished by the entire European Union in the same span. Recently, a coalition of 10 countries promised to supply another 1 million drones to Ukraine by February 2025. For their part, Russia has pledged to produce 2 million drones in 2024, importing thousands of Shahids and other drones from Iran. It's currently churning out upwards of 100,000 drones a month. With the introduction of autonomous AI-powered drones already seen on the battlefield in Ukraine, the potential of drones is expected to grow exponentially for the foreseeable future. Entire swarms of drones can be managed by just a few operators, and since these drones can navigate independently after a target is selected, electronic countermeasures that disrupt communication between drone and its operators are rendered moot. And what has Russia gained in more than 2.5 years of waging Putin's special military operation? While the strategic goals have varied, ranging from a pie-in-the-sky dream of bringing all of Ukraine into the influence of Russia to the more modest goal of laying claim to only those Russian-speaking areas in the east and south of the country, after 2 brutal winters and hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides, by the end of 2023, Russia laid claim to 18% of Ukrainian territory. That compared with 7% on the eve of the war and 27% in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. Ukraine owes much of its success to date to Western military assistance. Russia's invasion unlocked the coffers of the West, with many eager to assist President Volodymyr Zelensky defending his own country against Moscow. A coalition of 54 countries, including all 32 member states of NATO and 22 other states, have donated military aid both individually as sovereign countries and actively via EU institutions. More than $118 billion in direct military aid to date has been donated to Ukraine. The United States has far eclipsed its European peers in the amount of money spent funding Ukraine's war effort, having directly spent over $55 billion in military assistance. Germany, the United Kingdom, Japan, and Canada follow with $16 billion, $14.3 billion, $9.9 billion, and $7.8 billion respectively. Total donations often don't tell the whole picture, however. Not all GDPs are created equal. With donations visualized as a percentage of GDP, smaller European nations top the chart, with Denmark, Estonia, Lithuania each donating 1.8%, 1.7%, and 1.4% each. Taken together, the entirety of the European Union institutions, along with the United Kingdom, Norway, Iceland, and Switzerland, have collectively allocated a total of 110.2 billion euros for Ukrainian use, about half of which has been earmarked for military use. It took longer than it should have for the West to donate its best weapons for Ukrainian use, and some might fairly argue that they're still holding back for fear of retaliatory escalation on Moscow's part. Yet the money set aside for Ukrainian use have made it possible to send a smattering of high-tech weaponry that's helped Ukraine defend itself. While the effectiveness of tanks on the battlefield has been largely offset by the ubiquity of cheap drones, Ukraine has received hundreds of donated tanks since 2022. Poland, far and above, leads the way, with 324 tanks donated, 270 of them older T-72s, recently supplemented with 14 cutting-edge Leopard 2A4s. With a monetary value of $599 million, only the United States has donated a more valuable tank package, albeit far fewer, having sent Ukraine just 45 overhauled T-72s and 31 far more expensive M1A1 Abrams tanks. The Netherlands ranks second in total tanks donated, with 104, 37 of them being older Leopard 1A5s and 7 Leopard 2A4s. Germany has donated just 18 Leopard 2s. These, however, the later A6 model. The United Kingdom donated just 14 Challenger 2 tanks. Far more significant was the United States' donation of 352 M2 Bradley Infantry Fighting Vehicles, IFVs, fighting implements worth a monetary value that eclipses the $634 million spent on tanks by an extra $30 million. The Netherlands ranks second behind the US in donated IFVs, having donated 269 YPR 765s. Germany in third sent 140 Marder IFVs, with the Czech Republic, Denmark and Greece each ranking behind them, having sent several hundred versions of the older Soviet-style BMP. Because of their ability to suppress fortified positions, move quickly, and transport and medevac entire squads to and from the battlefield, IFVs, far more than tanks, have proven their worth in the attritional quagmire that is the battlefield today. One of the most valuable weapons of the war is the venerable artillery piece. Some analysts estimate that up to 80% of all casualties in Ukraine have been caused by artillery. It currently takes Ukraine 75,000 artillery shells a month to maintain their active front line, or between 2,000 to 3,000 shells a day. That may not seem like a lot, but it is. To put that into perspective, as of March 2024, the defense industries of the entire United States and Europe together could only produce a little over 3,000 shells a day, or 1.2 million munitions annually. Russia, according to conservative estimates, is churning out 250,000 munitions a month, or somewhere in the ballpark of 3 million a year. To date, the United States alone has sent more than 3 million artillery shells to Ukraine. As a means of illustrating the importance of artillery in the overall conflict, it's telling that the monetary value of all artillery systems sent by the United States to Ukraine sits just under $1 billion, $977 million, surpassing the cost of tanks or IFVs by $300 million. Most of these have been the highly mobile and effective 155mm M777 howitzers, 142 to be exact, out of 201 total pieces. Part of Ukraine's problem is that each country donates the howitzers it currently has in stock. While many of them fire NATO and US standard 155mm shells, they all use different parts and consequently can be difficult to maintain. Well over half of the artillery systems donated by the United Kingdom, for example, ranked second in overall artillery donations with 78, are the British-built AS-90 self-propelled gun. Italy ranked third with 76 pieces donated, a number of FH-70 guns in use by several European, Arabic and Asian nations. Estonia notably donated its entire inventory of FH-70 guns. Denmark and France donated 61 Caesar guns. Sweden sent 8 of its famed Archer howitzers. Germany and the Netherlands sent 40 PZH-2000s, 36 RCH-155s, and others. This only scratches the surface. Ukraine has found special use in Western multiple launch rocket systems, MLRS, longer-range missile systems which have been responsible for destroying untold millions worth of command and control equipment, aircraft, air defense systems, naval vehicles, and other expensive equipment. The United States sent 39 of its famed HIMARS systems at a monetary value of $588 million. The Czech Republic donated a dozen older RM-70s, while Norway sent 11 M270s, Germany 8 Mars-2 and HIMARS systems, and the UK, France and Italy each sending 6, 4 and 2 M270 systems respectively. While Germany seems to have lagged behind in its donations of military equipment compared to other countries, especially relative to its own GDP, it has led the way, far outstripping even the United States, in one crucial area: air defense. Germany on its own has donated over $4 billion worth of air defenses spread across 26 weapon systems. These include 24 Iris-T SLM systems and 2 Patriot systems. The Czech Republic and the United States have each sent 16 air defense systems, though these are not created equal. While the US has only sent 1 Patriot system, it sent 3 NASAMS and 2 Hawk systems, 6 of the latter having also been donated by Spain. At the mercy of Russia's long-range cruise missiles, drones and glide bombs, Ukrainian civilians rely on these air defenses to mitigate collateral damage and defend them on a daily basis. In the air, Ukraine is currently on track to receive 95 single-seat F-16A fighters and 2-seat F-16Bs from Belgium, Denmark, Norway and the Netherlands, though some put the number closer to between 60 and 80. Many experts claim this number will hardly make a dent in the ongoing war, though it will provide Ukraine with better means of bolstering its own air defenses and a stronger pathway to someday integrate its military into the US and European defense and economic ecosystem. It would take somewhere in the ballpark of 12 fighter squadrons, according to a recent CSIS report, to achieve the air support needed for the war on the ground, with 4 squadrons primarily responsible for each core mission set: enemy air defense suppression, air interdiction, and defensive counter-air. How many fighters is that, you ask? 216 F-16s, with 18 per squadron. It would be hard for Ukraine to maintain, let alone supply and control, an air force of that size with its own industrial defense base. Most of its pre-existing supply chains used to repair, reconstitute, and sustain its existing air units either trace back to the old Soviet Union and no longer exist, or are now under Russian control. Yet the conferral of Western F-16s marks a significant start to the process of wresting back a modicum of aerial control in this long attritional war. The more Ukraine integrates itself into US and NATO supply chains, the easier it will be to sustain its effort over the long term. According to the Pentagon, 2 years of war have not come cheap for Russia. We've already discussed the human costs, but what about the economic impact? As of February 2024, 2 years of military operations inflicted $152 billion in direct damage to Ukraine, but it cost Moscow $210 billion in the process. As part of the economic sanctioning, Russia also lost $10 billion in paused arms sales. Many have claimed that Russia, having overhauled its entire economy onto a war footing, will easily be able to outpace Ukraine in a grinding war of attrition. With the congressional pause in US assistance earlier this year, it was hard to argue otherwise. Ukrainian forces struggled to maintain manpower, morale, and supplies in the field as Russian offensives intensified. Yet the numbers in Russia also tell an eye-opening story. 2.5 years since Putin launched his full-scale invasion, the humanitarian and economic costs have been exorbitant. To maintain its facade that the war is going well, Putin's government, for example, has ramped up its tactics of fear and repression, and the consequences are becoming increasingly dire. According to OVD Info, a human rights organization that tracks political persecution in Russia, there are currently 892 criminal cases against anti-war dissidents. And if that's not enough to alarm you, 19,855 people have been detained at anti-war protests. That's nearly 20,000 individuals standing up against the war, only to be met by brutal crackdowns. Now here's where it gets even more concerning. OVD Info's data shows a significant spike in politically motivated detentions since the invasion. Of the 3,626 people in Russia who have faced these prosecutions since 2012, more than a third, 1,305, have been in just the last 2 years. That includes 728 in 2022, 521 in 2023, and 56 so far in 2024. It's clear that the Kremlin is doubling down on fear. But why? The answer lies in the nature of political change in Russia. Historically, real change happens when 3 things align: a divided elite, a disaffected public, and a lack of fear. The Putin regime knows this, and it's doing everything in its power to keep fear alive and well. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has backfired in a big way, especially when it comes to natural gas and their place in the European market. By launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia has lost a huge chunk of its natural gas market share in Europe, and the financial hit is massive. Russia is projected to lose between $27 and $34 billion in 2024 alone, depending on gas prices. To put that into perspective, that's about the same amount Russia had planned to spend on education and healthcare this year, but instead, much of that money has been funneled into Moscow's brutal war effort. Now here's where it gets a bit ironic. Europe has been trying to phase out coal while staying competitive in the industrial world, which would have actually increased demand for Russian gas. If Putin had chosen to focus on economic prosperity instead of waging war, Russia could have been on track to export over 184 billion cubic meters of gas to Europe in 2024, and that's regardless of whether the Nord Stream 2 pipeline ever came online. But what really happened? Russia ended up shipping around just 72 billion cubic meters of gas in 2023, and that number isn't expected to change much this year unless new sanctions hit. These numbers really highlight Europe's unprecedented pivot away from Russian energy and urgent need for Europe to fully cut ties with Russian supply chains. But here's the kicker. Energy exports are still Russia's main source of cash to fund its war in Ukraine, with nearly a third of the country's revenues coming from oil and gas. Russia's tech sector has taken a similarly bad hit since 2022. That year alone, about 10% of Russia's IT workforce simply packed up and left the country, along with over 1,000 Western companies. That's a big deal. The IT sector has been a huge driver of the Russian economy, accounting for nearly a third of its growth since 2015. In response to this exodus, Moscow tried to keep its talent by offering lower income taxes and better mortgage rates. But guess what? Those incentives didn't work. More than 100,000 young, highly educated IT professionals still chose to leave, creating a massive talent gap. According to Russia's Minister for Digital Development, the country's IT sector now faces a shortfall of over 500,000 workers. But that's not all. The situation is even worse because of the exit of major Western tech firms like IBM, Intel, Microsoft, and others. Before the invasion, Russia's tech industry was heavily dependent on Western inputs, everything from semiconductors to operating systems. With sanctions in place, access to this critical technology has been severely limited, and the alternatives just aren't cutting it. Chinese tech, which Russia has turned to, has proven to be an imperfect and expensive substitute. So what does all of this mean for the future? Russia's tech sector is now cut off from global connectivity, research opportunities, and the critical technology it needs to compete on the world stage. If this trend continues, it's likely that Russia will fall behind other global powers like the US, China, and the EU. Before the war, Russia's annual inflation was around 9%, but in the first year of the conflict, it spiked to between 11% and 17.8%. After that, thanks to interest rate hikes by the central bank, inflation dipped as low as 2 to 3%, but it's been creeping back up, hitting 7.4% this January. Interest rates have been all over the place too. The central bank slashed rates from 20% down to 7.5% between March and September 2022, but they had to hike them back up to 18% by July 2024 to control inflation. Russia's financial risk has also exploded. Its credit default swap, CDS, risk premium shot up from around 200 before the war to a staggering 13,800. Beyond military spending, Russia's economy is feeling the strain from Western sanctions. The EU has imposed its 13th sanctions package, and over $320 billion of Russian central bank reserves are frozen by Brussels, the G7, and Australia. On top of that, 70% of Russian banking assets and over 20 billion euros in assets belonging to more than 1,500 people and entities are under sanctions. Russia's exports have taken a massive hit, dropping 28.3% to $425.1 billion last year, with exports to Europe plunging 68%. Imports have stayed relatively stable, but the overall picture is bleak. Since the war began, countless companies have pulled out of Russia, ending operations, investments, and partnerships, while many countries and sectors have imposed sanctions or suspensions. Meanwhile, Russia's defense budget keeps growing, making up 23% of the total government budget in 2023, up from 21% in 22 and 20% in 21. There are other alarming figures. These are, for example, 685 current suspects identified by the Ukrainian Office of the General Prosecutor as instigators of war and propagandists of the Kremlin. Collectively, the office has also charted 125,698 registered crimes of aggression and war crimes. It's completed war crimes trials against just 238 military personnel. Russia has inflicted an extremely disproportionate and staggering toll on Ukrainian civilians caught in the crossfire of war. A recent report from the International Rescue Committee (IRC) estimates that 4.6 million Ukrainians need humanitarian assistance this year, including 3.7 million who are internally displaced. The report also highlighted over 4,000 attacks on education facilities, 1,300 on healthcare, and the destruction of over 1.5 million homes. The UN has updated its forecast for Ukraine's reconstruction and recovery costs to around $486 billion, up from $411 billion last year. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. An area the size of Romania is now littered with landmines, and the explosion of the southern Novokakhovka Dam in June left 600,000 hectares of arable land without irrigation. The Kyiv-based Center for Economic Strategy (CES) reports that Ukraine's unemployment rate skyrocketed from 10% before the war to over 30% during the conflict, before settling at 17% now. Food insecurity has also been a huge concern, with hunger affecting up to 30.3% of the population at its peak. Trade has taken a massive hit too. Before the war, exports and imports were roughly balanced at $7.5 billion each in January 2022. But the trade balance plummeted into the negatives, sitting at minus $3.7 billion by December. Grain exports especially suffered, though they nearly bounced back to pre-war levels thanks to the Black Sea grain deal brokered by Turkey and the UN until Russia pulled out in July 2023. Inflation in Ukraine has been wild, spiking from 10% in January 2022 to 26.6% by October 22, before dropping to 4.7% now. The economy, after shrinking massively in 2022, showed signs of recovery in 23, with positive GDP growth in the second quarter and beyond. Looking ahead, Ukraine will need around $15 billion just for immediate reconstruction and recovery in 2024, according to the World Bank. The focus will be on mobilizing the private sector and restoring housing, energy, and transport infrastructure. Since the war began, direct damage has already reached nearly $152 billion, with the hardest hit sectors being housing, transport, commerce, energy, and agriculture. As we've seen, the conflict has had devastating impacts, not just in terms of human lives, but also on the economies, infrastructure, and future stability of both Ukraine and Russia. The numbers tell a stark story of destruction, resilience, and the far-reaching consequences of war. But these stats are more than just figures. They represent real people, communities, and nations facing unprecedented challenges. As the war continues, it's crucial to stay informed and understand the broader implications of what's happening on the ground.
We don't have enough weapons. That was the claim made by Russian President Vladimir Putin in June 2023 as he held a meeting with pro-war bloggers in the Kremlin. Putin told the assembled crowd that during the course of the special military operation, it's become clear that there are shortages of many things: precision-guided munitions, communications equipment, aircraft, drones, and so on. It was a startling admission by a man who very rarely shows weakness, and it may have set the stage for something that happened just over a year later. Russia signed a cooperative defense pact with North Korea. On June 19, 2024, Putin and North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, confirmed that they had signed a pact in which each promised to come to the other's aid if they were attacked. While this raised the alarm in the West over the likelihood that Russia will help North Korea to develop nuclear missiles and submarines, the wording of the pact is also important to consider. Throughout 2024, several Western nations have permitted Ukraine to use the weapons they supply in Russian territory. That brings us to a question: why would Russia make a deal with what may be the world's most isolated nation, both geopolitically and economically? The answer is that Putin has failed to solve the problems he highlighted during his June 2023 speech, as Russia is on track to run out of all its weapons in its war against Ukraine. Let's start with some of the most important weapons Russia has been using: artillery. The Ukraine war has been characterized in part by Russian bombardments of Ukrainian positions using thousands upon thousands of artillery shells. In 2022 alone, it's believed that Russia fired up to 11 million shells at Ukrainian positions. The numbers have decreased since then, with Forbes staff writer David Axe suggesting that Russia now believes it needs a further 3 million shells to defeat Ukraine in February 2024. It's unlikely to get them. And even if it does, they may not be enough to win the war in the face of Western support Ukraine has received throughout 2024. But more worrying for Russia is that needing 3 million shells in 2024 shows how far its stockpiles have fallen since a year in which it fired more than 3 times that amount. Russia's struggles with artillery became evident within the first year of the Ukraine war. In January 2023, CNN ran a report in which it claimed that Russia's artillery fire was down by as much as 75% in some regions of Ukraine. Applying that to the previous year's volley of 11 million shells, this would suggest that Russia had run so low on artillery ammunition that it would only manage to fire around 2.75 million shells in 2023, a number that's suspiciously close to the number of shells Forbes said Russia believed it needed in 2024. The report speculated on several reasons for this massive decrease, including Russia rationing the shells it has remaining, or the country simply switching tactically to rely less on shells and more on other weapons. It's likely the former. The same CNN report notes that one senior US military official pointed out that Russia was being forced to rely on 40-year-old shells to maintain its bombardments. That use of degraded ammunition, combined with Russia reaching out to North Korea and Iran even back at the beginning of 2023, all point to a country that's been running out of artillery shells less than a year into the war. It gets worse for Russia. Not only is it running out of shells, but it's also running low on the artillery it needs to fire them. That information, again from David Axe for Forbes, claimed in January 2024 that Russia's soldiers are quickly running out of howitzer barrels for their artillery. These barrels are typically usable for several thousand shots before the steel used to make them becomes so brittle that they can't withstand further firing. Normally, a country would replace these degraded barrels with new ones fresh off the production line. Russia hasn't been doing that. Instead, Axe claims Russia is pulling Cold War-era howitzers out of storage. Quoting open-source analyst Richard Vereka, Axe said that these old howitzers aren't being sent to the front lines, it's their barrels that are heading to Ukraine. Russia is stripping those barrels, which are old but lightly used, and using them to replace the worn ones in its more modern howitzers. That's a problem because these older howitzers have typically been mothballed in poorly maintained storage facilities. The steel in their barrels may not have degraded much due to overuse, but they will likely have felt the effects of oxidation and moisture exposure over the last 40 years. So Russia is trying to make up for a barrel shortfall by pulling from old supplies that aren't especially fit for war. All of this may seem strange given that there are also reports of Russia producing far more artillery shells. In March 2024, CNN put the number at 3 times more than that produced by the US and the rest of Europe, suggesting that Russia is replenishing its stockpiles. But even then, that heightened production means it's creating 250,000 shells per month, amounting to 3 million per year. That's enough to cover the amount Russia claims it needs to win the war, but far below the 11 million shells it fired during the first year of the war. Russian officials also claim that the country is firing 10,000 shells per day, which would amount to 3.65 million per year, 650,000 more than it's producing. It's these shortages that have forced Russia to rely on the few allies it has to provide artillery shells. For instance, February 2024 saw South Korean intelligence officials claim that North Korea sent 6,700 containers carrying either 3 million 152mm artillery shells or 500,000 122mm shells in exchange for food and other goods from Russia. Throw Putin and Kim's recent pact into the mix and it's clear that Russia is being forced to rely on other countries to keep its artillery firing as it struggles to align production with the number of shells it uses daily. It's not just artillery that Russia is struggling to source. Even ammunition for basic weapons has been a problem throughout the war. In December 2022, Reuters reported on a senior US official's claim that many of Russia's soldiers are being sent to the front with old ammo. They have drawn from their aging ammunition stockpile, the official claimed, which does indicate that they are willing to use that older ammunition, some of which was originally produced more than 40 years ago. Again, we see a reliance on Soviet-era stockpiles rather than the production of new bullets. These claims back anecdotal reports that come from a similar time in the war, such as a Business Insider article that quoted Russian soldiers as they explained their predicament. The soldiers claimed that Russia threw us out into the field like dogs following their brief basic training, before they went on to say that Russia sent them to war with AK-47s, though no ammunition to load into them. No radio, no ammo, and not a f***ing thing. No medical supplies either, one of the soldiers claimed. So it looks like Russia's ammunition situation is, at best, inconsistent. Some soldiers have modern rounds, some have none at all. As for those who have older rounds, they face the predicament of having rounds that may only be safe to fire if the cartridges have been stored somewhere cool, dry, and lacking in moisture. That can't be guaranteed, given how much of Russia's equipment was mothballed, raising the possibility of cartridge jams when firing. One official, quoted in a Reuters article published in February 2024, summed up the issue succinctly. Russia's domestic ammunition production capabilities are currently insufficient for meeting the needs of the Ukraine conflict. That faltering production affects everything from artillery shells and rockets to the bullets soldiers should be able to load into their rifles. Of course, a lack of ammunition isn't the only problem Russia's soldiers face on the front lines, and it's a problem that you could argue is balanced by Ukraine's own struggles with munition stockpiles. Perhaps far more worrying for Russia is that it's also running out of a key weapon it's been using to gain ground in Ukraine: tanks. Estimates vary on just how many tanks Russia has lost. The Kyiv Independent quoted the open-source investigative project Oryx in July 2024, placing the number of Russian tanks damaged or destroyed in Ukraine at 3,180. However, that figure comes with the caveat that Oryx's data comes from open sources, meaning that the losses are likely much higher. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance certainly suggests they are. It maintains a live tracker of Russian losses in Ukraine, leading to its claim that Russia has lost 8,344 tanks as of July 3, 2024. Still, even 8,000 lost tanks shouldn't be too much of a problem for Russia. Global Firepower, which ranks 145 nations' militaries annually based on over 60 data points, says that Russia still has 14,777 tanks, with 10,344 of those tanks being in a combat-ready state. That means it should have enough for another 2.5 years of war, right? Not necessarily. For a start, production isn't keeping pace with the losses. Once again, we cite David Axe of Forbes, who states that Russia is only producing between 500 and 600 tanks per year. Even if we take the lower figure of 3,180 tanks destroyed, that means Russia is losing more than 1,000 tanks annually against a production of around half that number. The country simply isn't building enough tanks to refill its stockpiles of those it's losing. There's a gap in play. And it's that gap that forces Russia to do precisely what it's doing with its artillery, rely on Soviet-era technology to increase its numbers. Speaking to Reuters, Henry Boyd, the International Institute for Strategic Studies or IISS's senior fellow, claims that Russia is breaking even when it comes to replacing its lost tanks. He estimates that it had put between 1,000 and 1,500 tanks into service in 2023, though there is a caveat. Only 200 of these tanks, at most, were newly built. The much larger majority are tanks that have been mothballed for years, with T-55s even making their way onto the battlefield. As Boyd puts it, Moscow has been able to trade quality for quantity by pulling thousands of older tanks out of storage at a rate that may, at times, have reached 90 tanks per month. Boyd estimates that Russia's older tank reserves could sustain its war effort until around 2027, though that sustaining will come with a trade-off. Older tanks are less capable on the battlefield and far more vulnerable to modern anti-tank weapons, such as javelin munitions and drone strikes. So Russia will put more quantity onto the battlefield, but it will sacrifice quality in doing so, resulting in tanks being lost at an even faster rate than they were at the beginning of the war. And Russia faces another problem. Even its most advanced tanks aren't performing as well as Russia would expect on the battlefield. Take the T-90M, which the Kyiv Independent notes that Putin has often described as the best tank in the world. Ukraine has managed to destroy at least one of these tanks using a pair of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, which have been in military service since the 1980s. So Russia finds itself in a position where its best tank is not only facing modern weapons the West has supplied to Ukraine, but it's being taken out by older fighting vehicles. As we've moved deeper into 2024, the situation has only gotten worse for Russia. Toward the end of June 2024, Newsweek published a report on the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung's use of satellite imagery and artificial intelligence to work out how many tanks Russia has left. The paper analyzed 87 military sites, 16 of which were bases known to store tanks and armored vehicles, to get a count on the number of tanks Russia has lost since the beginning of the war. The 111th Central Tank Reserve base of the army, located in southeastern Russia, was one of the bases. Before the war, that base held 857 tanks. Now it's empty, with Süddeutsche Zeitung's artificial intelligence suggesting that Russia has lost at least half of the tanks deployed from that base. IISS research analyst Michael Gerstad sums up Russia's situation by suggesting the nation likely has around 3,200 tanks still in stock, though the vast majority of them are in bad condition and require significant repairs. If that's the case, Global Firepower's estimates are well off the true state of Russia's tank situation. Therein lies the tank problem for Russia. Does it invest an increasingly limited set of resources into restoring 3,000 old and battered tanks, or use them to build far fewer but new tanks? Either way, its battlefield losses are outstripping its means of production. Russia's armored vehicle situation isn't looking any better. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Information, or Minfin's figures, Russia has lost 16,095 armored fighting vehicles, or AFVs, as of July 3, 2024. These vehicles aren't used in the same way as tanks, which excel at breaking through battle lines, but are instead typically used to transport troops and carry out small attacks. Minfin's numbers seem to align with other estimates of Russian AFV losses, with Newsweek reporting in May 2024 that Russia had lost 14,246. It's not a huge stretch to imagine another 1,000 or so have been destroyed in the months since. Much like with Russia's tanks, Newsweek reports on the use of satellite imagery to determine how many AFVs Russia has left. Reporting on a post by an X, formerly Twitter account run by a user named Jompy, Newsweek shared that satellite images reveal Russia has just 10,389 AFVs left in storage. That's down 32% on the country's pre-war stocks, suggesting 4,763 older AFVs have been removed from storage as of May 2024. Digging into specifics, Newsweek notes that Russia has lost over 1,500 MTLBs, which are Soviet-era amphibious AFVs, meaning it only has 922 left from a previous stock of 2,527. BMDs are another major loser. The number of airborne and amphibious tracked infantry AFVs is down to 244 in stock from the pre-war numbers of 637. You may have spotted a trend here. Just as it has with its artillery and tanks, Russia has found itself relying on mothballed Soviet-era armored vehicles to continue fighting in Ukraine. These AFVs are being lost in huge numbers, in part because they're not technologically advanced enough to combat the drones that Ukraine has been using to destroy them. Chapter 97, translating a report published by the RBC Ukraine, highlights the severity of this problem. It also notes that Russia is resorting to using AFVs built in the 1970s, with some that have found their way into Ukraine being from the 60s and 50s, and that it's quickly running out of these older vehicles. It quotes Arta Ray, an Estonian military blogger, who claims that Russia will have run out of these mothballed AFVs by mid-2025, putting it in a situation where it'll need to produce more to keep its troops supplied. It's trying to do so. In February 2024, Forbes reported that Russia is building around 4,500 armored vehicles per year to replenish its faltering supplies on the front lines. An impressive number for sure, though one that doesn't keep pace with the country's losses. Ukraine has already destroyed over 15,000 AFVs in the war, creating a tally of around 6,000 per year, meaning that Russia's heightened pace of production isn't enough. Moscow will run out of AFVs as long as Ukraine keeps destroying them at the same rate it is now. If you need any more evidence that Russia has an AFV problem, you only need to look at recent purchase by Moscow. 2,100 Desert Cross 1003 all-terrain vehicles from China,
While that name may sound impressive, the reality is that these all-terrain vehicles are essentially heavy-duty golf carts that offer practically no protection to the unfortunate soldiers forced to drive them. They weigh around 1.5 tons, about the same as the average car, and have 85 horsepower engines. And Russia is already using them in support roles on the front lines. These golf carts have already been the subject of ridicule and, more damaging for Russia's forces, have already been demonstrated as being extremely vulnerable to drone attacks. The Forbes report points to one such strike carried out by a drone, which killed a squad of 7 soldiers as they attempted to use one of the carts to assault a Ukrainian position in Berditschi in March 2024. Golf carts on a battlefield. The fact they're being used at all showcases how dire Russia's armored fighting vehicle situation is. Still, at least it has plenty of missiles it can use to strike Ukrainian positions. Or does it? Reports often vary on Russia's missile stockpile, though there have been rumblings that it was running low almost from the war's beginning. In October 2022, Politico published an article in which it quoted several Western officials saying that Russia was experiencing a shortage of long-range precision missiles just 6 months into the war. One of those officials, speaking about Russia's early strategy of destroying as many Ukrainian power stations as possible, said the country was increasingly having to rely on Shahed drones purchased from Iran to carry out its strikes. Why? Its stockpile of cruise missiles was running low. Our assessment is that the ability for the Russians to continue with these saturating barrages of precision weapons is getting to the point now where this will be unsustainable, the official said in October. A January 2023 report in Defense and Security Monitor offered a more mixed viewpoint. It noted that Ukraine believed that Russia only had around 20% of its pre-war missile stockpiles left, amounting to just 550 missiles, or enough to conduct attacks on 2 or 3 cities. Russia, of course, denied this, claiming that it had enough missiles to continue the war, before adding they have thousands left and the ability to build more. Still, it's telling that Russia was already purchasing Iranian missiles at this point in the war, with Ukraine also pointing out that it was repurposing its S-300 and S-400 air defense missiles to attack ground targets. That repurposing wouldn't be needed if Russia had enough missiles. Plus, it's worth remembering that Putin himself has told people that Russia is running low on precision-guided munitions, suggesting that Ukraine may have been correct in its assessment. Running low isn't Russia's only problem. Just a month into the war, Reuters published a report that claimed some of Russia's missiles may have a failure rate as high as 60%. Quoting a trio of US officials, the outlet said this rate of failure is one of the reasons why Russia failed to compromise Ukraine's air force during the first month of the war, despite having launched 1,100 missiles. Air-launched cruise missiles had failure rates between 20 and 60%, claimed one of the officials, with others having failure rates as high as 50%. For context, a failure rate above 20% is considered high by these officials, meaning that Russia doesn't just have a stockpile problem. It's also dealing with many missiles that simply don't work. Russia also has an eye toward the future when it comes to its missiles. It believes it has reached a stage of open confrontation with NATO that, though it hasn't escalated into war, means that Russia needs to build more missiles. Speaking to Russia's RIA state-owned news agency in May 2024, Russian ambassador-at-large, Grigory Mashkov, made the open confrontation claim, while saying Russia hopes that direct armed conflict will not follow. Still, Mashkov says that Russia needs to be prepared, noting that it has to take further steps to strengthen the country's defense capability, including building up the missile arsenal, in order to discourage any potential enemies from testing Russia's strength. First Putin, and now a prominent official. Both say that Russia doesn't have enough missiles, with the ambassador putting that into the context of a possible future war with NATO. That means its stockpiles have run low enough due to the Ukraine war that it needs to replenish and is likely going to increasingly rely on drones ahead of missile strikes to preserve what it has left. Missiles were supposed to be another of Russia's trump cards in the Ukraine war. Still, there was another key advantage it had back in February 2022, a much stronger air force. Fortunately for Putin, Russia has failed so terribly at developing aerial dominance in Ukraine that it's also started to run out of planes it's trying to use to win the war. Minfin provides basic figures for how many aircraft Russia has lost so far. As of 3rd of July 2024, it claims that Ukraine has destroyed 360 planes along with 326 helicopters. The situation has become so bad for Russia that it's barely using its air force in the war, instead relying on ground troops to achieve its objectives. However, barely using doesn't mean it's not using planes at all. It's just that those planes are getting shot down at an incredible rate. Take what happened in February 2024 as an example. Forbes reports that this month saw Ukraine conduct what it dubs a Sukhoi massacre, in which it managed to shoot down 4 Sukhoi Su-34 fighter bombers and 2 Sukhoi Su-35 fighters in just 3 days.
That's notable because these planes are among the best in Russia's air force. Russia is far from in a position where it's going to run out of either of these planes. It still has 125 Su-34s and around 110 Su-35s. The problem here is that the few times that Russia has deployed what's supposed to be its best planes in Ukraine, they've been shot down. While it may not be running out in pure numbers, it's running out of situations, or perhaps the tactical knowledge, to deploy these aircraft. If that's the case, Russia may as well not have any at all. March 2024 brought with it reports that Ukraine is also chipping away at Russia's stockpile of A-50 spy planes. Russia has lost 2 of those planes to Ukrainian attacks in the first 2 months of 2024, in addition to seeing a base it uses to repair the planes damaged by a Ukrainian drone strike. A Newsweek report notes that Russia now has just 6 A-50s left, a definite shortage given that it relies on these planes to conduct aerial surveillance and reconnaissance. Lieutenant General Kirill Budanov, who heads Ukraine's GUR intelligence agency, says that taking out one more A-50 would mean Ukraine prevents Russia from maintaining 24/7 operations. Russia is already trying to replace its downed A-50s with reconnaissance drones. Note that we said drones and not planes. That's because, as the Wilson Center reported in April 2024, the West's sanctions against Russia are preventing it from building more of its own planes. Most of the effects are being felt in Russia's attempts to build more commercial airlines. It initially, illegally, kept more than 400 foreign planes when sanctions were first instituted, but they're carrying over to the country's air force. After all, if Russia isn't getting the parts it needs to build its commercial airliners due to sanctions, it's also likely not receiving what it needs to build more military aircraft. In this case, Russia isn't going to run out of planes. It still has hundreds left, especially in its Soviet-era stock. However, it's proven itself so ineffectual at launching aerial assaults that it's barely using its air force. And when it has, it's having to watch Ukraine shoot down some of its best planes while it struggles to replace them. Finally, we come to ships. Russia's navy is in no danger of running out of ships. As Global Firepower reports, it has 781 naval assets. The problem is that the vast majority of these ships aren't involved in the Ukraine war. In fact, the only ships that it has that can fight back against Ukraine are part of the Black Sea Fleet, which contains around 60 to 70 of Russia's vessels, or at least it did. Ukraine has managed to destroy or damage around a third of the Black Sea Fleet since the beginning of the war, severely compromising Russia's ability to use its navy to strike Ukraine. Combining precision missile attacks with drone strikes, Ukraine has been whittling away at the fleet, safe in the knowledge that Russia isn't able to replenish it. Why? The Montreux Convention. Signed in July 1936, the Montreux Convention is notable because it essentially grants Turkey control over the seaborne passage through the Dardanelles and the Bosporus, collectively known as the Turkish Straits. Specifically, Article 19 of that convention says that Turkey can close access to the Black Sea via these straits to any military ship that doesn't call the sea its home base. That's precisely what it's done since the war began. No vessels from the Russian Navy, or from any other country's navy for that matter, can enter the Black Sea. Russia was able to keep the Black Sea Fleet in place because it was stationed in the sea, but it couldn't supplement that naval force with any new ships. So Russia isn't at risk of running out of ships on the global level, but in the context of the Ukraine war, it's already lost a third of its ships and it can't rebuild the Black Sea Fleet because it's banned from sailing military vessels through the Turkish Straits. It's running out of ships it can actually use to fight against Ukraine, with the rest of its navy essentially being ineffectual to the same degree as the country's air force. There's no point in having over 700 naval assets if you can't bring them to the fight. The final question is simple. Where does all of this leave Russia? It's facing a situation where it's increasingly less able to keep its troops supplied with modern weapons, forcing it to rely on Soviet-era stock and other countries to keep weapons flowing in. Russia has attempted to boost production, as we've seen with its artillery and AFV building, but it's unable to keep up with the pace of the losses it's experienced in Ukraine. None of this means that Russia is on the verge of losing the war right now. It still has stockpiles, and it's shown it's willing to sign pacts with countries like North Korea to get what it needs. But each passing day weakens Russia's military as it burns through more of its weapons. That only spells bad news for the country in the future. But what do you think? Will Russia eventually lose the Ukraine war because it runs out of weapons? Or does it have enough to continue to slowly gain ground in Ukraine? How big a role has Western support played in helping to drain Russia's supplies?
The Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was meant to be a special military operation that would result in Kyiv being captured within a few weeks. That didn't happen. While Russia's forces did manage to approach perilously close to Kyiv in the first few months of the war, Ukraine managed to gain an edge and push the invaders back. Yet for the past 30 months of warfare, Ukraine has been consistently on its back foot, trying to prevent Russia from pushing deeper into its territory. By the start of August 2024, Russia had occupied roughly 18% of Ukraine's territory, while Ukraine had been focused solely on surviving the onslaught of the meat grinder. But the scale of war seems to be tipping towards Ukraine. Perhaps the most pivotal and newsworthy moment in August 2024 has been the August 6th invasion of Kursk by Ukraine. That's right, Zelensky has managed to put Ukraine on the offensive for once, trying to get an advantage over Russia and capture some of its aggressors' territory in turn. How did this happen exactly? Well, the Kursk invasion didn't happen by sheer coincidence. Russia has been slowly shedding its military and economic power over recent years. The Kursk invasion is but a mere symptom of Ukraine being able to capitalize on Russia's more apparent weaknesses. And those weaknesses are only going to grow. So let's take a deeper dive into how exactly Ukraine managed to score a victory on Russia's soil, why Russia can't defend its territory, and what this means for the future of the war. Let's start by outlining the current extent of the Kursk invasion. On August 6th, the Ukrainian army sent a relatively small contingent of troops across the Russian border and into the Kursk Oblast. According to Russian reports at the time, the size of the invading force was around 300 troops, backed by 11 tanks and 20 armored vehicles for soldier transport. Of course, Russia believed that this invading force would be easily repelled by the present border military. Early reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense suggested that that's exactly what happened, painting a picture of the Ukrainian military losing 50 troops and being forced to back away at the border between the two countries. However, the Russian scheme of smoke and mirrors in intelligence reports couldn't hold merit for long. It soon became clear that the Ukrainian army had not only managed to invade the Kursk Oblast, but had done so with minimal losses or even actual fighting. Ukraine was using its long-range artillery and drones to shell Russian defensive positions at Kursk, mainly targeting areas without a significant civilian presence. Over the next few days, there were no reports from the Ukrainian army about the progress of the invasion, and the reports from Russia became increasingly frantic. By August 9th, it was clear that Ukraine had managed to push through the border, occupying an area between 6 and 25 miles into the territory of the Kursk Oblast, depending on the news sources that were covering the event. Regardless of the extent of the Ukrainian occupation of Russian territory at the time, one thing was clear. Ukraine had somehow managed to plow its way into Russia, and it looked like they weren't going to stop anytime soon. What followed was, frankly, a mess of Russia's incompetence and the Ukrainian army's superior experience. Rather than fighting their way through the Kursk region, the Ukrainian invasion was a set of small skirmishes followed by a sweep of Russian troops surrendering as they were being surrounded. 10 days into the invasion, one of the Ukrainian prisons reported that it had already processed over 300 Russian soldiers as prisoners of war, and the warden stated that the number would likely reach thousands long before Ukraine ended the Kursk campaign. So what exactly happened to cause such a distinct difference in combat styles between the Ukrainian invasion of Kursk and the constant back and forth that's going on inside the Russian-occupied pieces of Ukrainian land? The answer is a bit complex, but it can be boiled down to Russia slowly running out of soldiers. Let's start with the more obvious route, the Russian troops stationed in Kursk. According to the prison that's processing the Russian POWs, nearly 80% of the new arrivals were fresh conscripts, who likely had only a few weeks or months of surface-level military training. If the trend follows throughout the entire Kursk region, it's safe to say that Russia has basically been forced to send its newest recruits to guard the border regions that didn't see much fighting at the time. Considering that Russia has been adamant about pushing deeper into Ukrainian territory, it's likely that the more experienced and better equipped troops are being sent to the front lines closer to Ukrainian cities. It's not a terrible tactic per se, but it's shown that Russia does have a few kinks in its military that it can't solve. Why is this important? Well, numbers matter, and Russia should have had a clear numerical advantage. At the start of the invasion, Russia's population was roughly double the size of Ukraine, and similar discrepancies existed in the size of the country's militaries and available manpower. With roughly double the number of soldiers available, Russia theoretically had a significant upper hand in the invasion. But Russia has also been losing both troops and available manpower at an alarming rate. According to Ukrainska Pravda, a news outlet that outlines Russia's daily personnel and equipment losses, the Russian army has suffered over 600,000 casualties over the past 30 months of warfare. That's roughly double the number of troops Russia had at its disposal when invading Ukraine in February 2022. Effectively, Russia has churned over multiple generations of conscripts to try to win over Ukraine, and its efforts were paltry in comparison. While Ukraine did lose roughly 18% of its territory so far to Russian occupation, 2024 was a relatively stagnant year. Russia was forced to fall back at the end of 2023 and didn't mount a significant offensive campaign until May. And Russia's summer campaign of 2024 was undoubtedly a significant failure. Russia is purported to have lost 70,000 troops over the course of 2 months, setting up a precedent of losing between 1,000 and 1,200 soldiers per day. Worse yet, Russia doesn't seem to be getting better at keeping its troops intact, with the casualty rates refusing to fall below 1,000 per day for months, even after the main stage of the summer campaign can be considered over. Russia did manage to make some progress over the year, but it's not nearly enough, especially when compared to the sacrifices made. According to a report by The Telegraph, Russia has occupied an additional 450 square miles of Ukrainian territory between January and July 2024. This includes the large failure that was the summer campaign. But fast forward to today, and Ukraine has managed to occupy 390 square miles of territory in the Kursk Oblast. Even more importantly, there are clear options for Ukraine to cut off a large swathe of the region south of the River Seine by bombing bridges and other vital infrastructure that connects the area to the rest of the region. If Ukraine retains control of the territory to the east, i.e. going close to Sudza, an administrative center for a sub-region, it can surround the Russian forces south of Seine. If the trend of recruits surrendering before the incoming Ukrainians continues, it can occupy a much larger swathe of territory relatively bloodlessly and gain more POWs in the process. Effectively, Ukraine has the potential to occupy more territory in a month than Russia has managed in 7 months, all the while being on the defensive in its homeland. This neatly showcases the differences between Russian and Ukrainian militaries, especially in terms of technology access and troop quality. Ukraine has managed to make do with a much smaller force, backed by several waves of aid from NATO and other countries around the globe, which provide vital military equipment, ammunition, training, and economic relief. For example, both Russia and Ukraine were forced to use Soviet-era equipment and ammunition, particularly as their main battle tanks and mid-range artillery. Russia's advantage in that aspect was the fact that it was probably the only country that could feasibly make more of the ammunition suitable for these weapons. On the other hand, Ukraine was using up its limited supply of Soviet-era ammo quickly. The US and NATO came to Ukraine's aid, scouring for ammunition compatible with these weapons from all countries they could access and sending it all to the Ukrainian front. A video report by the German media outlet Der Spiegel showcased the situation best. A World War II Soviet artillery launcher was being used by Ukraine to shell the Russian troops with ammunition sourced from Germany. That same launcher was on the front 70 years ago, using Soviet ammunition to shell German troops. Both sides of the war quickly progressed past Soviet-era equipment. For much of the war, the state of the conflict was one of attrition, with neither side making significant progress. The reason? Drone warfare. A foot soldier or even a tank was no match for a remote-controlled flyer that could drop death from dozens of feet above, all while its handler was kept safe and sound miles away. Then the war started taking an entirely different dimension, one where the prime targets were drone operators, who became increasingly vital parts of both militaries. Both countries sourced military-grade drones in the first few months of the war. The Turkish Bayraktar TB2 on the Ukrainian side and the Iranian Shahid 136 on Russia's were a large part of why neither army could make significant progress against the other. The TB2 had the advantage over US drones by being nearly 6 times cheaper to buy, while still boasting the ability to cruise independently and slot a few remote-deployed air-to-ground munitions. It allowed Ukraine to make devastating strikes relatively deep into Russian territory, cutting off the Russian army from supplying the occupied pieces of Ukraine. On Russia's side, the Shahid 136s were used to pressure the Ukrainian forces by being relatively disposable one-way kamikaze drones. Additionally, Russia had the economic and industrial capacity to manufacture drones that closely resembled the 136s, giving it an independent supply compared to Ukraine. By comparison, commercial drones were used on both sides to great effect. Since the base models were relatively easy to purchase for both sides, typically sourced from China in one way or another, both armies had a relatively stable supply. Modifications to convert the drones into kamikaze drones were also relatively simple. Eventually, both Russia and Ukraine relied on existing drone designs and sought to improve them. For example, the Skyton Raybird 3 is one of the newest generation drones made entirely in Ukraine. It boasts the ability to fly over 1,550 miles per mission and makes precision strikes on vital military compounds by dropping an air-to-surface munition, all guided by the drone operator and assisted by AI. Additionally, the Raybird 3 included several defensive measures that the Ukrainian army could leverage as an advantage in the increasingly tech-dependent war. First, the drone could be deployed remotely, with the deployment system disassembled a few minutes after the launch. This minimizes the enemy's chance to detect where the drone was launched from and retaliate, which makes it far safer for the drone operator and support crew. Secondly, the drone was designed with anti-interference technology, something that both sides of the war have started using as second nature as drone strikes escalated over the previous year. But drone warfare is just one part of the technological equation. NATO has been approving bolder plans to outfit the Ukrainian army with more advanced vehicles and military equipment. These include the M1 Abrams tank, one of the most modern main battle tanks available to the US military, and the F-16, a fourth-generation all-purpose fighter that heavily outmatches Russia's Su-27s of the same generation. Various NATO countries have joined forces and supplied 65 F-16s to Ukraine, while Zelensky had suggested that the country will need at least another 100 F-16s to have a fighting chance. The F-16 started taking flight in August 2024 after NATO provided months of training for Ukrainian fighter pilots. What does this mean for the state of the war? Since Russia has lost hundreds of aircraft and helicopters over the past 30 months, more than 300 of each, according to Ukrainska Pravda, the new contingent of F-16s will allow Ukraine to gain more of a foothold in its own airspace and provide vital support for its troops across the country. This means that Ukraine's improving air combat or long-range drone capabilities will allow it to put even more pressure on Russian ground forces. It creates a precedent where Ukrainian gains could be more permanent in nature compared to Russia's, which will be vital in helping Ukraine win the war. But as we mentioned before, it's not just the Russian military that's taken a hit over the course of the war. A large part of why Russia is stumbling now is because its economy has been tailored to focus on the military efforts, cannibalizing all other industrial sectors as a result. Let's take the country's governmental efforts as an example. More than 30% of the government's budget has been allocated to the national defense and military, a figure that is far beyond what other modern countries are used to. In terms of GDP, it means that Russia is spending roughly 7% on national defense. Compare this with the US at 3.5%, or the NATO average at around 2.7%, and you can easily see that Russia is trying to pull itself out of the hole it dug by running full steam ahead into military budgeting. Of course, Russia has been able to allocate so much of its budget to its military due to it being one of the largest suppliers of oil and natural gas worldwide. It was previously one of the EU's biggest trading partners for these precious resources. After the invasion started and the EU reduced its dependence on Russia's gas and oil, China and India took over as the largest importers of these resources. Throughout 2022 and 2023, Russia's economy was even seemingly better than those of Western nations, outpacing the predictions made by the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. In fact, Russia is one of the few countries whose economy grew in 2023, which can be largely attributed to the fact that it managed to get good trade deals with China and reduced its dependence on trade with NATO countries. However, the reliance on the energy sector came with significant downsides. As the magnates in the industry grew richer and could open more positions to fill new roles, people from other sectors, such as manufacturing and agriculture, came to work in the energy sector, leaving the previous ones underpopulated and struggling to meet demands. As a result, China became one of Russia's biggest trading partners in many consumer products, including cars, tractors, and smartphones, completely dominating Russia's manufacturing industries due to lower prices. In contrast, China's trade deals with Russia were also heavily favored toward China, with China getting natural gas at nearly half the price that the EU was paying just a year before. The favorable winds of trade with China didn't last long. While the trade between the countries rose by over 26% in 2023, reaching a record high of $240 billion in yen and rubles, the growth for July 2024 is estimated to be only 1.5% over the previous year. A contributing factor may be that the Chinese imports of crude oil and gas have fallen by 7% compared to the previous year. This could be explained by China extending its global trade efforts by focusing on the Belt and Road Initiative, which ultimately aims to provide China with ready access to Middle Eastern oil. While most of the plans were put on hold due to the invasion, China's ambitions mean they're likely to resume the efforts in case the war goes on. But more on that tidbit later. If China ultimately succeeds in cutting the flow of Russian gas and oil, Russia would end up having very few buyers, which could topple the energy industry overnight. This could be devastating to Russia's economy, since we already mentioned that the other industries have started taking hits as more people left to work in the energy sector. But that's only one sector in which Russia is experiencing loss of manpower. Another major drain that Russia has experienced as a result of the invasion is severe emigration. Immediately after the invasion began in February 2022, Russian citizens were scrambling to leave the country to avoid being drafted or subjected to the pro-war authoritarian regime heralded by Putin's ideology. According to some estimates, roughly 200,000 people left the country within the first few months. By the end of 2022, the number of Russian emigrants has been estimated to be close to 1 million. According to Russia's Alfa Bank, the country has lost roughly 1.5% of its available workforce from emigration alone. The people who left Russia were typically high-skilled blue-collar workers, so Russian companies suddenly experienced severe staff shortages. These numbers have to be compounded with the countrywide conscription efforts over the course of the war. According to some estimates, Russia's military has roughly 1.3 million active personnel, with another 2.4 million support personnel and 2 million reserve troops. It's a significant part of the potential workforce being driven to the front and used as fodder for the meat grinder that is the war of attrition against Ukraine, where unmanned drones and long-range strikes reign supreme. To put another spin on Russia's economy, or lack thereof, Reuters suggests that Russia has a shortage of roughly 4.8 million workers. That's close to 5 million job openings that remain untouched since the country has no capable people to fill them. The country's borders with the Western world are completely closed, and a significant chunk of the emigrants don't have plans to return to the country regardless of how the war ends. All things considered, Russia's economy might look good at a glance, but it's being propped up by unreasonable measures and is largely considered to have gone past the point of no return. With the economy being so dependent on pieces effectively outside of Russia's control, it would take only a few moves by Russia's largest trading partners to cripple the country in the long run. So far, we've spoken at length about Russia's failing economy, but surely Ukraine isn't doing much better, right? Well, the answer is both yes and no. Ukraine has arguably been hit much harder by the war economically. The country is spending upwards of 37% of its GDP on national defense and military, making it the 8th-ranked country in the world in terms of military spending. At the same time, Ukraine has been on the receiving end of generous international aid packages. According to the U.S. Council of Foreign Relations, the U.S. has allocated $175 billion in foreign aid to Ukraine, $107 billion of which is direct financial aid. The rest is used internally in the U.S. to manufacture weapons and ammunition, pay for staff, or send to Ukraine's neighboring countries, which are housing displaced citizens, such as Poland. On the other hand, the Kiel Institute reports that the European countries have allocated a total of 110 billion euros, roughly $122 billion, to Ukraine, whether through a combination of direct financial aid or bilateral agreements, with another $85 billion left to be allocated. Altogether, the US and European countries have spent more than $350 billion supporting Ukraine, and that only accounts for direct aid agreements. As a result, Ukraine has been able to stay afloat, even if that's not the best term, by relying on overwhelming support from allies to keep the military running and the equipment flowing into the country. In contrast, Russia is under increasing pressure from most Western countries, as sanctions have prevented it from directly trading in US dollars. The disruption of political relations between Russia and the West goes beyond preventing trade. Other sanctions have also targeted Russia's ability to obtain vital technology that can be used in weapon systems. It's one of the main reasons why Russia has been forced to rely on Soviet-era equipment. When Putin announced that Russia would deliver more than 1,500 tanks to send to the front line, roughly 85% of these tanks were older T-72s, T-62s, and even T-55s, which are woefully under-equipped to deal with the threats of modern warfare. This was evidenced by the fact that Ukrainska Pravda claims Russia has lost around 8,900 tanks and more than 18,000 armored vehicles over the course of the invasion. Simply put, Russia has been forced to continuously use and reuse its old battle tanks and salvage them to keep sending more metal to the scrapyard that the front line has become. While Ukraine has also received some older vehicles, in part because its army has been trained on using them first and foremost, the addition of the M1 Abrams tanks, or the HIMARS artillery systems, presented a notable improvement in the country's military tech level. This harkens back to why Ukraine has been able to successfully invade Russian territory and achieve a significant territorial occupation. Since Ukraine has received so much help from NATO and other allies, the army has put these improvements to the test in the Kursk incursion. The effect is twofold. One, Russia's military morale has started to falter. With the waves of surrendering soldiers passing through the Kursk region, there's a much higher chance that Russian citizens will realize that Russia is not the overwhelming aggressor it claims to be. The new conscripts are nowhere near as capable of maintaining the quality of the Russian army that the country had before the invasion, and the rapid recycling of soldiers will likely only deteriorate that quality further. Ultimately, Russia will be forced to loosen up its offensive efforts on Ukrainian soil, which they ramped up as a response to the Kursk incursion, and send some of its forces to liberate Kursk. By the time the Russian military gets to that, it'll be too late. There are an estimated 200,000 civilians who have been forcefully displaced from the Kursk region. The ones who are in Kursk were privy to the significant difference in how Ukraine treats Russian civilians versus how Russians treat Ukrainians. The invading army in Kursk has delegated significant resources to help the Russian civilians receive humanitarian aid with the help of international organizations. In contrast, the early months of the Russo-Ukrainian War saw multiple Ukrainian cities being shelled indiscriminately. Even today, Russia is still launching strikes on Ukrainian hospitals, an act that goes against the Geneva Convention. Furthermore, the war has been disproportionately affecting Russian minorities. The conscription efforts so far have targeted the poorer, less urban areas of the country, promising wages that are double or triple the national average. Conversely, Moscow has been largely unaffected by conscription, but has seen a significant brain drain as part of the emigration waves. When push comes to shove, Putin might be forced to use Muscovites in the army, and the remaining residents of Russia's capital might finally get a sense of how the country has fared over the past 30 months. If, or more likely when that happens, the entire regime in the country might fall due to internal rather than external pressure, and we might finally see Putin forcefully removed from office. The other advantage Ukraine has received as a result of the Kursk incursion is media coverage. The country's previous efforts were focused on protecting its existing territory and pushing back against the Russian onslaught. By showing that the Ukrainian army not only has the means to repel Russia, but to inflict significant losses in a counter-invasion, the Western interest in the war has likely peaked. If there were any doubts about Ukraine being able to stand against Russia, those are likely being dispelled as we speak, and politicians can look more favorably on sending Ukraine even more aid. Ultimately, this move may very well secure Ukraine a few more rounds of financial aid. This can work in Ukraine's favor to end the war as soon as next year. And that's not an unreasonable claim, considering that the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the CSIS, outlined 2024 as the pivotal year for the war back in February. The CSIS claimed that Ukraine will spend 2024 in preparation for what could very well be the final push, as both countries will rapidly go through the available financial and military aid offered to them. The CSIS suggested that the final throes of the war will happen as early as 2025, as new tactics, key pieces of military tech, or overwhelming aid tilts the scale in one country's favor. Seeing as the prediction was made in February, it's not unreasonable to suggest that the Kursk invasion is exactly the type of turnaround that the CSIS was suggesting. It aligns perfectly with Ukraine's goal of obtaining more funding, creating a different military tactic from what it used previously, and threatening to tear Russia apart from the inside via moral exhaustion. The advantage for Ukraine is likely to be an advantage for all European countries. In the aftermath of Russia starting the invasion of Ukraine, most NATO countries in Europe have vowed to increase their military funding and modernize their own militaries. Through that, the Eastern Bloc of NATO will likely become more effective and more unified than ever before, and most of that power will be projected against Russia. Simultaneously, Russia's biggest ally, China, has been oddly silent during the war. If China sides with Russia fully, it stands to lose much more than it could gain if Russia wins the war. The US controls a major trade choke point that China uses in maritime trade, and the US Army has been modernizing to directly counter the Chinese threat. With China kept in a stalemate by the US, Russia will inevitably be forced to review its increasingly diminishing list of political and economic allies. With most of the world backing Ukraine, Russia may find itself on the receiving end of a special military operation, this time orchestrated by NATO, to end the war. But what do you think? How long will the Russo-Ukrainian war last and how will it end?